Hello, ladies and gentlemen, today is March the 9th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, Baldur's Gate 3, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, what's up?
Not much. I just had dinner, which was a win. But I lost a companion from my solo honor mode run permanently due to a story event. Yes.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
Yeah. Our duo run is normal. I didn't play that off stream. It was my solo run, and I went to go fight Cazador. And anyone who doesn't want spoilers, mute me for 3 minutes. We go to get Cazador, and I'm like, hey, we should bring Astarion because he has extra voice lines in this zone. So I bring Astarion, and he's like, never been in this room before. Never been in this room before. Wow, I've really done some really bad stuff in my life. Oh, hey, Cazador. Oh, shit, I'm stunned permanently for the whole fight and removed from the party. So he can't even be helped. And it's like, what the fuck? And then on top of that, if you talk to Cazador first, you don't get to initiate on him. He rolls super high initiative. The only person who had higher initiative than Cazador was the person who I gave a vigilance elixir to. But everyone else rolled below him. He can teleport around. He goes gaseous form. He casts 6th level spells. He casts Call Lightning in an AoE. The dude is crazy. And when you and I fought him, we just kind of walked up, snuck up behind him, stunned him, beat the shit out of him in like a turn and a half, which is super smart. And I'm like, let's talk to him to see what happens to Astarion. He gets turned into a pile of goo. So Astarion was consumed in the Ascending ritual. Cazador completed Ascending, and he forced me to retreat. I left the fight. My Tav was knocked off the side by his knockback with the Bat Swarm, and Gale and Shadowheart ran back to Withers and said, Withers, who can you res? And Withers said, I can res Track 6, your haughty drow, but I can't res Astarion. He's a pile of goo. And I was like, shit, okay. So we sub out Astarion, put in Minthara the monk, and just beat the shit out of him. But he's crazy. My Astarion was weak. I wasn't very invested in my Astarion, to be honest. I was kind of casually interested in what the character would have to say in those situations, but I didn't really run with him regularly in the party. My current loadout is Shadowheart, Minthara, Gale. But yeah, I wasn't prepared for that. But he just like ran to go punch Cazador, and then Cazador froze him. And then bound him, and it was like, God, that was not a good opener at all. We should have just shot him in the back. But yeah, that's what happened. We survived it, got his loot, but Astarion's now gone forever.
That's too bad. He has some good lines. There should be a way to get him through that, because I definitely know that he's not supposed to turn into goo.
No, it's if the fight starts when he's held, you need to like free him or help him. I don't know how to do it, but you would need to navigate yourself around Cazador and unbind him so he can rejoin the party. Gotcha. That's my guess. But I wasn't able to do so because I used the same wall of fire technique on the stairs to like soak up all the ads, which to me seemed good. But yeah. I wasn't able to like get back around to the back and access him. I could have gave someone an invis potion, but I was already down a party member, and then one of my party members was close to Cazador, so I had to like full retreat. It is very bad.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Sounds like. Good.
But yeah, that's my solo honor mode run. That's called Neuro. Yeah, that's the same thing that I said when Apop killed Shadowheart in the run that we have together. He just like chose the dialogue option where you decide to fight her directly 1v1, and it's like, what the fuck, bro? But yeah, that's quite the video game. Today's stream is sponsored by Trey Dude. Thank you for the 111 months. Appreciate you, brother. But how's your week been?
Oh, lots of taking notes, lots of Stellaris. Lots of getting bitched out on YouTube.
Yeah, we had some opinion havers this time. Shout out to the opinion havers. I realized that we don't have a completely representative take on every issue. And for certain issues, we will definitely be choosing a side. And that's just how it is. Love and respect, but sometimes we believe the truth to be something that you believe it to be. That happens all the time between fellow humans. And I appreciate people who continue to watch, even if you disagree with us. And as long as you're not breaking TOS, it is cool to hear your opinions. So, Russia-Ukraine issue, maybe you're on the other side of the information. You are a human being. You're entitled to express your opinion as long as you're trying to do so respectfully. Thanks for engaging. But yeah, very spicy comments said this week, for sure. I noticed it too.
Yeah, there was a lot of drama as far as trade policy. So that was sort of the genesis of it. I had said that there was a lot of kayfabe going on with the administration's trade policy. And this past week, they definitely took some very proactive steps that did not feel like kayfabe. So I don't begrudge people for doubting me on that. But I still think it's early. We'll see where things stand in a few weeks. I still don't buy that the administration is really going to double down on this, but we'll see. We'll get into it. It's in the notes.
Well, another note of the strategy, at least for how I understand it, is you've got so many things happening so often that people's collective memory of this will be distracted by the next new thing that's happening. So the accountability of pushing through something that's a very complex international shift requires a lot of paperwork, a lot of handshaking, and a lot of figuring out the details of how stuff is enforced. And that takes time. And it seems like there's been such a flurry of stuff being changed, and the difficulty in enforcing and adjusting everything seems like a big question mark. Which of these things are going to be prioritized? Because not all of them are going to be prioritized equally. We shall see.
We shall. So what did you want to get to first today?
I've been very disconnected from news. I've been streaming a ton. So if you want to ask me about Dota people, I can talk to you a lot, but I haven't been checking news too much. I have been occasionally, for leisure, scrolling YouTube shorts and watching crazy professional poker hands. People like Tom Dwan, Daniel Negreanu, stuff that I was studying back when we shared the apartment in that period where I was first learning poker, and then we returned to Texas, and I still dabbled in online stuff. But yeah, those are pretty funny ways to amuse oneself. I haven't found a regular news channel for me because I yeeted Reddit from my phone. So yeah, I've been very dark to like news and what's been going on. And chat hasn't really mentioned anything huge this week. I don't know if there's like one big meme item, because some weeks there is one. Chat, if you could say something about something big that happened.
Yeah, I don't think there was any one thing that would have led them to spaz out, so I'm not surprised. Canadians certainly very excited these days.
Yeah, well, I think it's also alarming for Canadians too, because as Americans, we haven't ever really talked shit about Canada or like contested our relationship with them in ways that we've said negative stuff. So it's new and alarming. Maybe. Sorry, Canada. I think well of you as a country, and on average, you are more developed than us per capita, I think, in several categories.
Yeah.
But you're our neighbors anyway. We love you, Canada. Sorry about the nasty words. I hope you realize that not everyone thinks those things about you.
Yeah, I don't begrudge anybody in Canada being upset with the United States right now. And I think somebody in the YouTube comments made the point that even if all of this is theater, it's still very harmful theater, which I agree with. You know, I hope I've kind of driven that home at times in the commentary, but you know, just because the Trump administration isn't really serious about doing a lot of the stuff that it threatens to do, even just the uncertainty it creates can create big waves for people that are very disruptive to their lives, their livelihoods, and in some cases can be lethal, as we talked about last time with regard to the PEPFAR disruptions. So it is meaningful, even if it's superficial bullshit.
It changes your table image, even if you're not betting money. The way that you act to other countries, it changes how they perceive you. There is reputation, kind of like there is in video games, of you need X reputation to unlock this item purchase in a video game. In real life, there's a similar thing of how well a country sees you influences what options they give you for trade and alliances and that kind of thing. So talking shit usually is going to be distancing yourself from a potential ally, as opposed to celebrating a culture's strengths, being like, your country is pretty cool. I like that you have this insert food item and insert music. It's really easy to find something that's cool about other countries. So for me, staying positive and just appreciating humanity, like, just because you aren't from a country doesn't mean it's not awesome in its own way. Even if it's not the way that you would choose, we all have a very rich history at this point. So there's some bare minimum of respect that's owed, especially since we didn't even choose what country we spawned in on, as far as we know. So to judge other countries based on where they spawned is like, they didn't choose where they spawned. That's like a dice roll based on what the previous generations were doing.
Well, that's the enlightened perspective. But I don't think anybody could accuse the 2020s as an era of being particularly enlightened. So unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of that in governance right now, in the developed world or the developing world for that matter. You know, there's a kind of school of realism that really sees going tough on other countries as being the ideal, because they see the world as a dog-eat-dog world that necessitates a hard line. So in that sense, disrespect can be useful in so much as it imbues your threats with more credibility and in turn improves your negotiating position when you're trying to get something you want or need from another country. Now, realism has been around a long time, and academic realism has its place. Actually, for the record, realism isn't really a thing anymore these days. It's actually, in academia, neo-realism, which is the main form of realism, which is kind of a newer school of thought that tries to address some of the weaknesses that have been pointed out in the pre-existing realist school of thought. But that's not really what you see with something like the Trump administration. You know, what you see with the Trump administration is not so much realism or neo-realism. It's a kind of lumpen realism, you know, that is, it's kind of like a dumbed down realism, which kind of venerates austerity as an exhibition of strength and venerates mistreatment of other countries as being a sign of strength. And neither of these things are really being done purposefully. You know, they're being more done for their own sake, in the belief that it improves your negotiating position and therefore are goods in their own right. But that's a very self-defeating way to approach negotiations. You know, you should identify something that you want, something substantive, and then have a plan to get it. You know, just applying pressure on a counterparty just to see what they'll give you if you do. Besides just being unethical, it's also stupid, since it means that the other party is going to hedge against you to mitigate your leverage over them, which is going to reduce what you can get out of them over time, so that if there is something you ever really need from them, you're probably not going to be in a position to get it later. So short-sightedness and self-defeating maneuvers are definitely things that I've long associated with Donald Trump, certainly from his first administration. Unfortunately, while some things about his second administration are better than the first administration, in this particular regard, they don't seem to be. And a lot of people are suffering on account of it, regrettably so.
Yeah, we'll see what the effects are and how it shifts our institutions and also our global perception. But the United States as an entity has existed for a long time. And one administration, even if they get 2 terms, is still a small amount of that, relatively speaking. So inertia is strong. That's what I'm getting at.
Well, we'll see. Sometimes there are eras that crop up that can be sufficiently disruptive to break trend. We may or may not be in one of them. So on that fun note, you want to get into Ukraine?
Sure. How are we doing?
It's been quite the roller coaster for Ukraine the past 2 weeks. So last time, we were coming off of what was about 2 days after the big blow up when Zelensky came to Washington last Friday. Well, not last Friday, but 2 weeks ago, to try to sign a mineral deal that wasn't actually a mineral deal and still isn't. And we've kind of been living in the aftermath of that, trying to see how substantive that blow up was and whether or not things could get back on track. So I said last Sunday that I didn't think it was significant and that the administration probably would correct, basically, that it would eventually soften and move back to its pre-existing position, which is that it was probably going to support Ukraine if they agreed to some kind of peace deal, blah blah blah, that kind of thing. More or less, that's the trajectory that we're on. They still haven't fully returned to it yet, and there's certainly been lots of moves antithetical to Ukraine. But given all of the noise I'm hearing out of Republicans in the Senate, officials in the administration, they're dropping lots of hints and signals that they do want the relationship to get back on track, and that the blow up was mostly theater. So I'm not willing to quite admit yet that I'm wrong. There's some evidence that I am. And I said from the start that I could easily be. There's no telling with the Trump administration what they're going to do. But in general, the trajectory has been to try to sign the mineral agreement and then eventually get some kind of peace agreement with Russia. Whether or not any of that is really feasible or even meaningful, still up in the air. But I don't buy the idea that, one, Trump is a Russian agent, or two, that the United States is going to completely abandon Ukraine. I still don't think that's in the cards yet, given what I've seen thus far. So people are, of course, welcome to criticize on that count. It's an open debate. I don't doubt that there are people who give me shit for it, understandably so, but that's where I am right now. So to get into the details of the past week and the corresponding drama, there's been a lot of pressure on Europe to try to contribute something that in order to get a peace agreement finalized. The administration has been insisting that there be a European component to the peace agreement involving some kind of troop deployment in the form of peacekeepers. So in that vein, there have been negotiations in Europe and amongst European countries about what that could look like. One of the ideas that they came up with was a partial 1-month truce between Russia and Ukraine that would cover air, sea, and energy infrastructure attacks, but not ground fighting. So this is something that emanated from Paris. President Emmanuel Macron and his foreign minister shared this as a possibility. It's a very weird idea. Normally if you have ceasefires in war, it's a full ceasefire. Maybe not for very long, maybe a 24-hour ceasefire, a week-long ceasefire. But having a ceasefire that only applies to one aspect of the fighting, and not even to ground fighting, which is generally the main part of the fighting in Ukraine right now, that's very unusual. I don't know that I've ever heard of that before. I don't think it's going to work. For one, Ukraine is definitely going to be disadvantaged in that, because right now Russia has more of an edge in terms of the ground fighting. So, air, sea, energy infrastructure attacks, well, more so air and sea, that'll hurt Ukraine more, I would expect. Energy infrastructure attacks, obviously that helps Ukraine. Ukraine has been hitting Russian infrastructure a bit, but Russia has been able to hit them harder, so a suspension in that vein could be helpful. But beyond that, I don't really see this as being that beneficial for Ukraine, and Russia, for its part, has no reason to either. So not sure what the genesis of this idea was. It kind of came out of nowhere for me. But it's relevant because it does show that European leaders are trying to come up with ideas. Obviously, famously, the Trump administration has kind of not entirely locked them out of the peace negotiations, but isn't entirely consulting them either. So this could be them trying to exercise some leverage in that vein to show that they're capable of coming up with ideas that could be an alternative to whatever is going on in the Russo-American negotiations. So to get back to the mineral deal, what's been going on with that? So I think after last Sunday, Zelensky posted something on social media that aggravated Trump. Zelensky was quoted as saying, the end of the war is very, very far away, which I don't think is all that controversial. But of course, the Trump administration is on record. Trump himself is on record saying that the end of the war, or at least a ceasefire, is relatively close and we can do it. So Trump's response to this was, predictably negative. He said that Zelensky should be more appreciative of U.S. support, and that this is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky, and that America will not put up with it for much longer! Exclamation point. So after that, a little grim.
The worst thing that could have been said. Come on, dude. The hyperbole. Jeez. You could say some pretty heinous shit. The worst thing that you could say?
I mean, it's Trump.
Yeah.
We all know his style by now.
Yeah. Sorry, it just rustled me. It's okay. Because I logically thought of, like, what is the technically worst thing that he could say? Because he could say some bad stuff. You can say bad things. Today we were just talking about slurs that you shouldn't say on Twitch. And it's like, yeah, there's some stuff that you shouldn't say. The worst thing that you could say, really? I don't know. But, yeah, you're right. It's the style. It's a style.
Yeah, you just kind of have to correct for it.
Yeah.
Just kind of make that mental adjustment to try to translate it.
What he says versus what he means by that.
Yeah. So let's see. After that, White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz went on to Fox News, and he outlined some of the conditions. Well, he was asked about what Ukraine basically could do to get the relationship back on track, and so he outlined some of the conditions. Waltz said that Zelensky should show that he has regret for what happened, that he's ready to sign the mineral deal, and that he's ready to engage in peace talks. He also added that we'll see what happens in the next 48 hours, but that, quote, we are certainly looking to move forward in a positive way, end quote. So that's a relatively positive sign. It suggests that it suggested anyway that the relationship was not irreparably harmed or anything, which is what I'd expected. Mm-hmm. And that Zelensky basically just had to engage in some performative bullshit to kind of get the White House back on their side. So, exhibiting regret for what happened, that's cheap and easy. That's just cheap talk. The mineral deal, as I explained last Sunday, is bullshit. It doesn't actually involve really minerals at all. So, that's an easy sign. It doesn't cost them anything. And then exhibiting that Ukraine is ready for peace talks, that's also easy. Obviously, Zelensky and Ukraine in general want to make sure that any peace talks are favorable to them and cater to their needs. But that said, I don't think the Trump administration, or even necessarily Trump himself, really expects to otherwise. I think he just wants them to come out and engage in some kind of performance where they exhibit that they are willing to do and to accept a peace agreement at all. Because one of the propaganda lines in the United States right now is that one of the reasons there's not peace already is because Ukraine has been intransigent, that they have been resistant to a peace deal in the hope that the West will come and try to force Russia, possibly by force of arms, to give back all of the territory they've lost. So if the Ukrainian government could come out and say that we're totally actually ready for peace, even if it might mean giving up some territories, that would be favorable for the Trump administration, just in terms of optics. I would point out here again that this is not going to be like a binding thing. The Ukrainian government could totally just reject a peace agreement that they feel is not to their needs, or just pretend to go along with it without actually honoring it later on. That's well within their rights as a sovereign nation. So I think the Trump administration, again, knows all that and just kind of wants them to engage in the kayfabe with them, as discussed last week. So that was what I got out of the Waltz interview. So after that, there was more Trump bullshit, a little carrot and stick. He hinted on Monday that a deal to open up Ukraine's minerals to U.S. investment could still be agreed, despite his frustrations. Quote, I just think he should be more appreciative because this country has stuck with them through thick and thin. He also suggested Ukraine's leader might be out of office if he fails to reach an accord with Moscow. Quote, it should not be that hard to make a deal. It could be made very fast. Now, maybe somebody doesn't want to make a deal, and if somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long, end quote. So, open to a deal. but also some threats. Maybe if you don't agree to a deal, then we coup you or something. We eject you from office somehow. I don't really think that's a credible threat personally, but again, it's Trump style. So I think this is kind of Trump's way of suggesting that there is room here for a deal, which could get the United States back on Ukraine's side, so to speak. I think we're already on their side. Again, the whole thing is just performative bullshit, if I'm right about the kayfabe. So this is just more performance in that vein. But that was the next thing. Then after that, there was a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania named Brian Fitzpatrick. Also on Monday, he spoke to Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, and he said that he believed that the signing of the mineral deal was quote unquote imminent. He also read, and this is Fitzpatrick again, wrote on Twitter ahead of the announcement, quote, "We are 100% getting this train back on the tracks," end quote. And he suggested again that the mineral deal would be signed in short order, which would lead to a strong long-term economic partnership between the U.S. and Ukraine, and which will ultimately and naturally lead to security assistance. So that, again, more evidence that the administration was actually interested in maintaining a relationship with Ukraine. It wasn't just going to abandon them. As an aside here, one of the lines that I've heard from the administration and from some of the administration supporters on the internet is that Zelensky should sign the mineral agreement because if the United States had investments in Ukraine, then there would be an incentive for the United States then to defend Ukraine if it came under attack again by Russia after a peace deal, if a peace deal were signed. And that's not a real security guarantee. You know, if you're Ukraine, that isn't nearly going to be sufficient enough. For one, it's not a credible threat. Like if you're Russia, seeing that the United States has investments in Ukrainian minerals is not going to deter them from attacking again. Because as the Ukrainian government itself has pointed out, there were already American investments in Ukraine before both Russian incursions in 2014 and before 2022, and those were not sufficient to deter an invasion. And I don't see any reason why some kind of new surge in American investment in minerals would change that equation. So that's not realistic. Like just economic investment, rather, that is not going to be a sufficient security guarantee for Ukraine. And the idea that it is just transparent bullshit. I don't buy that at all, and neither should anybody else. So that said, the next thing was the aid cutoff. So after these mixed signals from the Trump administration, Washington, that is to say the Trump administration announced that it was going to quote unquote pause aid to Ukraine. And this again was on Monday. Monday was very busy. We found out a little later that this would not just involve weapons and whatnot, you know, the physical aid. It also involved a pause on intelligence sharing. And I found out about that when the Daily Mail reported that the U.S. was revoking the UK's permission to share intelligence with Ukraine, presumably intelligence from the United States. At the time, it wasn't really clear the extent to which that intelligence pause would go. There was a lot of gnashing of teeth for a few days because it seemed like it was a full pause on intelligence sharing, but then it became apparent later on that it was actually just a partial pause. So, for example, defensive intelligence sharing has still been allowed. So Ukraine has actually still gotten forewarning about Russian attacks and whatnot. Its offensive operations, for example, ranged attacks on targets within Russia that have been paused because the Ukrainians had been getting a pretty significant amount of intelligence support from the United States in that vein. So that's more what's been paused here. Still don't like it, but it's not as bad as a full pause. So obviously the pause in aid had people very excited because that obviously seems like something Russia would very much want. And it wasn't clear how long it would last. Technically, it's still in place. It could last if the Trump administration does want a full break with Ukraine. This is definitely something they would do as a step in that direction. But my counter argument there is that if they really wanted to do that, why wouldn't they have done it already? There isn't any reason for them to drag this out. You know, and I think I brought this up last week. If they really want to abandon Ukraine, they're just going to do it. There isn't any reason for all of this drama. I guess you could say they want ratings, you know, the kayfabe again. There's some truth to that, but if they did full-on abandon Ukraine, I think that would generate considerable ratings in and of itself. So I think that a lot of this drama is just the administration trying to pressure Ukraine, especially, but also Russia, into some kind of peace deal. And this brings me back to a prediction I made at the end of last year, which is that one of the things the Trump administration might try to do, if it fails to get a peace agreement or even a ceasefire, it might push significantly for a short-term ceasefire so that it could frame it as a peace agreement. And then when that failed later on, it could just blame whomever, or maybe even just ignore it. And in the meantime, continue aid to Ukraine and whatnot as before. That seemed to make more sense to me than either a full-on abandonment of Ukraine or an actual substantive push to a peace deal. Because I never thought a peace deal had really strong prospects, given how much leverage that Russia has right now. So performative ceasefire seems like a more likely end game here, what the administration is doing. And in so much as Ukraine is resistant to that, I think that explains more of the pressure that the administration is bringing to bear here more recently. But that could also be me giving the administration too much credit. It could be that the pause in aid was just meant more as punishment for the kayfabe blow up on Friday. This could just be more performative shit by Washington. It's hard to tell. This is just my best guess here. But it could go either way. Regardless, aid was cut off, intelligence sharing was paused, and it seemed like the administration was really piling on the pressure on Ukraine. The administration was not entirely clear just what it wanted. You know, the Trump administration, both this term and previous term, were famously bad at communication, as I recall. So everything was up in the air after Monday. After that, haggling over security guarantees. So this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but let's just get through it here. The administration argued that having U.S. firms in Ukraine relating to the mineral agreement represented a security agreement in and of itself. Like I explained before, that's bullshit. Vice President Vance expressed doubt regarding the utility of European peacekeepers. The administration does want Europe to kind of take responsibility, but Vance personally, and this could be the view of other isolationists in the administration, actually is opposed to European peacekeepers. Their perspective is that not only do they want the United States not to be involved in Ukraine, but they don't want the Europeans on their own accord to do anything that might escalate the conflict, because the isolationists are concerned that that might accidentally drag in the United States. So Vance's perspective here is that sending in a couple of countries with militaries that haven't fought a war in 40 years wasn't going to matter. You know, from his perspective, European militaries are not in a position to really deter Russian aggression. And as you can imagine, that was a little bit upsetting for all of the countries in Europe that contributed troops to various American missions in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 20 years, which obviously is more recent than the 40-year time frame that he painted it as. So he had to clarify after the fact that he wasn't talking about countries like the UK and France, but rather other countries that have been promising to contribute. So another little blow up there.
That's the problem with dissing with a wide net. You just diss a broader group, and that insults the people who sacrificed people on the front lines with you. You're like, y'all didn't do shit for us for 40 years. And it's like, brothers and sisters, what about the recent stuff? We sent our people too.
Yeah, Vance hasn't really done much to impress me in his time as vice president, and I'm still confused why he's even weighing in on this. You know, consider 4 years of the Biden administration. How often did you see Kamala Harris do like anything public facing for the administration? Like, it was pretty rare. And her team even complained about it multiple times. They felt that the Biden admin wasn't doing enough to kind of put her forward so that she could kind of later on have a stronger chance to run for office. It wasn't until Biden stepped down that that changed, and she kind of really came out and started being more public facing. But then there's Vance here, and he's just everywhere.
He's aggressive.
I think
he's very aggressive.
He is. He's very opinionated. I think somebody either in chat or in the YouTube comments said that you know, the administration wants to build him up. You know, and I get that. Administrations in the past have done that, but this seems unusual to me. You know, generally vice presidents do more minor stuff, even when the administration is trying to kind of build them up and give them an opportunity to build a reputation. So it still seems odd to me. And given the things that he said, how incendiary they've been, I don't really see it as being very helpful.
Well, if you think about it, it's a couple different advantages. One of them is it's a social power play, which has been used against me in the past with WoW guild drama, as one example, where I was scheduled a meeting with one individual, and that person brought another person to the discussion to kind of back them up and make it a 2 versus 1 conversation. So Vance showing up, if he follows Trump in all of Trump's opinions on stuff, then that only benefits the social power dynamic. We have 2 opinions versus your 1. So you're automatically outnumbered even if you're correct on something. And then another thing is they have a very similar conversation strategy. Who is Trump's previous vice president again?
Mike Pence.
Mike Pence, completely different person than Vance. Can we just point that out? The VP this time is very, very different than last time. Very different.
Yeah.
Pence didn't take the same social kind of strategy and dynamic of talking shit and being very forward conversationally. He's like the Christian vote. It's like, we need someone to win the Christian vote. Get Pence. Yeah, he's going to do their stuff. He talks in their words. So he was like the Christian dude who represent that demographic. Now we've got 2 who basically are the same archetype. And socially speaking, that means there's a lot of cohesion where they're always on the same page. Vance's job is to back up Trump all the time, and he does so. So for that reason, he's kind of like a younger version of himself, basically. So they're a really, I would say, harmonious team dynamic between each other anyway. As far as I know, maybe they argue off camera or something, but that is an interesting thing to point out, is that he's gotten a lot of camera time and a lot of key conversations. He's heavily involved in them, where normally the vice president isn't really involved to that level.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike Pence was very much like an evangelical, right? That was that was why he was basically given the position, right? You know, when you run for president, you pick your VP, you pick your VP based on constituents that you want to appeal to. So, you know, if there's some group that maybe you yourself don't necessarily appeal as much to, you'll find a vice presidential candidate that appeals more to them. So Trump obviously is not really the ideal candidate for evangelical Christians for a whole variety of reasons. And in his first term, well, when he was running for president in 2016, he picked out Vance specifically to appeal more to that group, to try to assuage concerns about, you know, some of the harder edges of Trump's personality, which somewhat contradict the teachings of the Bible. Effective, it worked, until, you know, 2020, when his supporters were screaming, "Hang Mike Pence." But in his second term, he didn't really feel the need to reach out to the evangelicals so much. He kind of felt pretty confident that he had their vote, which, you know, he did. And so Vance was picked more to appeal to purple states, you know, specifically Midwestern swing states, which were expected to be the key deciding states in the 2024 election.
The thing is, I feel like the left has such a poor grasp on the Christian vote right now that Trump doesn't need to do anything for them to get their vote.
Yeah.
Like, the left is so different from what Christian conservatives want in many categories. Chat, correct me if I'm wrong. But I feel like it's an easy layup just to be on the red team. You're on the red team, you have the Christian vote right now. The left hasn't really made an effort, partly because a lot of the conversations and stuff have been around how traditions have served us poorly and which traditions are wrong and which traditions are new and should be celebrated and respected. So people who are old school, so to speak, yeah, they're going to be voting red team most of the time, from what I've seen anyway.
Yeah. And I concur. And I think that does explain why he hasn't really pandered as much to them. But that still doesn't explain to me Vance's minion behavior, right? Pence was never quite so sycophantic. You know, he could have his moments, but Vance seems to be going out of his way to be kind of Trump's mini-me. And it's unusual. I haven't really seen that from a VP. Anyway, Vance's behavior aside, other things going on with regard to the haggling over Ukraine. Poland has come under significant pressure to send forces to Ukraine. But they say that they're not going to make a decision about that before elections, which are going to be held in May. And I thought that was interesting because it was kind of a sneak peek into the negotiations happening behind the scenes on that count. Because again, there's a lot of pressure for Europe to kind of deploy something to Ukraine as part of the peace deal. And you would expect Poland to be particularly gung-ho about that, since Poland has been very pro-Ukrainian for the most part since the war started. But they've been a little hesitant to send troops directly. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues to be the case, or if maybe there is a substantive change in that regard after the elections. Regardless, the fact that they're conditioning a decision on the elections does mean it's going to be a few more months before we actually see any traction on that. So we could be waiting a while before we see any kind of resolution to the current sort of mini crisis regarding American support for Ukraine and what Europe is going to do about it. Let's see, the Prime Minister of the UK has came out and said this past week that if European countries could come out with pledges to increase their defense spending and a plan to ensure the security of Ukraine, then Trump will offer a security backup. Now, like we discussed last week, this is something that Europeans have said. Some pro-Ukrainian European leaders, anyway, have said that if that they're willing rather to contribute troops to a peace deal, but they're still going to want some kind of U.S. backstop. They think that a European commitment by itself would not be sufficient, and they want the United States to have some kind of role as far as helping secure Ukraine in the future. And so Starmer here is kind of pushing that line, saying that if Europe is willing to go hard enough, then Washington will do that. I haven't really seen signals out of Washington in any of my reading to necessarily back this up, so I thought this was pretty notable. This could be Starmer talking out of his ass, just trying to drum up support in Europe for some kind of peacekeeping mission. Or this could be a substantive reflection of Washington's actual position, which perhaps has been unvoiced thus far in public, which is that if Europe actually does make a credible commitment to deploy peacekeepers to Ukraine, then Washington would actually help them, but that otherwise it will not. And that kind of speaks to the kayfabe theory again. If this is accurate, then that means that Washington is kind of bullshitting about abandoning Europe, and that they're just trying to pressure Europe into being more proactive on Ukraine so that some kind of progress could be made on an eventual peace deal. So some notable signals here worth talking about. So to get back to the mineral deal bullshit, Zelensky made some posts in the past few days basically exhibiting contrition. So he posted some stuff on social media saying that he was ready and willing to sign the mineral agreement whenever convenient, and that the agreement could be signed as early as Wednesday. And the National Security Director Ratcliffe in the United States said that Zelensky's social media post would, quote, likely see an aid intel sharing resume. Would likely see aid intel sharing resume. So that seemed to be a positive sign, and that kind of backed me up again in my kayfabe theory. Another official also came out and talked about the mineral deal. This was at a Council of Foreign Relations seminar. The Trump official in question was asked specifically, point blank, what Ukraine could do to get aid back. And he said that they should sign the mineral agreement. Now, there's a caveat here, which is that after this, Trump came out and said that he might actually, has hinted, there are hints here that Trump may want more than just the mineral deal as a quid pro quo for continued American support. Trump has apparently, according to an article in NBC News here that I found, Trump has privately made clear to aides that a signed minerals agreement deal between Washington and Kiev won't be enough to restart aid and intelligence sharing. He wants to see also a change in Zelensky's attitude towards peace talks, including a willingness to make concessions, such as giving up territory. And he also wants to see movement towards new elections in Ukraine, and possibly a stepping down of Zelensky.
You got to vote yourself out.
Yeah, so again, that's not Trump himself. That's an article citing sources in the administration. So it may be that there is more. This is evidence that there is potentially a break in the making between the United States and Ukraine, if they actually do want to go hard on this. But you could also interpret that as this just being the kind of performance that Trump wants Zelensky to do. You know, he wants them to make. He might want to make him make a big show of being willing to give up territories and being willing to hold new elections. Whether or not Zelensky actually has to credibly commit to doing that stuff, I don't know. But at the very least, I expect that this is evidence that Trump will at least ask him to pretend to do them. But as I said before, I leave open the possibility I'm wrong about the kayfabe and that this may be something that Trump genuinely wants him to do, and that this is the administration trying to leverage Ukraine towards a peace deal that it might not otherwise want to sign. So that's the latest on the mineral deal. I'm expecting, given the talk that I've heard, that there's going to be some kind of new signing ceremony this coming week. And after that, there could be more changes. Keep in mind, after Trump called Zelensky a dictator, a few days later, when it looked like Zelensky would sign the minerals deal, Trump pretended not to know that he had called him a dictator. So we could be heading towards another one of those. What is it? 1984, you know, we've always been at war with Oceania. We could, by the end of next week, have the Trump administration saying, you know, we've always intended to back Ukraine, and none of this other stuff that suggested otherwise ever actually happened. So that's entirely possible, and that's happened plenty of other times with the Trump administration, certainly in the first term, also increasingly in the second term. So that's why I'm so resistant to this idea that, you know, all of this is substantive evidence that the Trump administration really wants a break with Ukraine. You know, they whipsaw so frequently and bullshit so much about what their actual position is in any given negotiation that I'm always deeply skeptical that what the administration does and says at first glance is a clear indication of what they actually want. Generally, that's not the case. It's entirely possible for the administration to pull a complete 180 at any given moment. So that's what I'm predicting. I'm standing by that prediction, even in light of the past week. We'll see where it goes. Still very much in the air. And I would point out that, you know, the stuff going on with Ukraine is actually less confusing than the stuff going on with tariffs. That's coming up here. So I'm more comfortable sticking by my guns here on Ukraine than I will be with the tariffs. Again, that's pending. So what else has been going on with Ukraine? So the peace negotiations, which are still ongoing. The experts that I've read on this are confused, unsurprisingly. For one, the United States has made a number of concessions unilaterally to Russia for no perceivable return. So among those, one, the United States is asking, maybe demanding, that Russia be readmitted to the G7, which is an informal group of countries that kind of meet annually to discuss issues of mutual concern. Russia had been kicked out of it as a result of its invasion of Ukraine. Now the administration is saying that they should be brought back in. The administration is also proposing mutual arms budget. Well, I'll just read the quote: a proposal to mutually slash arms budgets. That's a little unusual. Normally, arms reduction agreements have very fixed points of reference for how many weapon systems should be reduced and verification mechanisms. I don't know that there's been a proposal to reduce budgets simultaneously before. I think that's a new one on me. So that was put out as a possibility. There's also a couple others that I did not see mentioned in this article that could be unilateral concessions. One is the suspension of aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine. And another one is the Department of Defense announcing that it was suspending offensive cyber command operations targeting Russia. That's also in the notes for later, but that's something that happened in the past week, and you could consider that a concession. Whether or not it happened as a result of the peace negotiations and is part and parcel therein, or if it's something that the Secretary of Defense just decided to do on his own, which is entirely possible, that's not clear. But I'm throwing it in here as a possibility. Now, there's also been some reports that the Trump administration has requested Vladimir Putin mediate U.S. nuclear negotiations with Iran, and that the United States and Russia have begun secret talks on reopening the Nord Stream pipeline. The mediation with Iran, that's pretty feasible. Russia has kind of done that before, so that's not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Nord Stream, that is very deeply weird. I don't even know that Germany actually wants it to be reopened. And it's entirely possible that, whoever blew it up in the first place could always just blow it up again. I'm looking at you, Ukraine. So I don't really see that as being useful or even really a concession. So again, some mixed signals here. Like, I don't really know what the administration is trying to do with those particular items. So some unilateral concessions, and then some weird shit that doesn't really seem to mean much out of context. Now, for Russia's part, they've laid out some of their conditions for a peace settlement over the course of the past 2 years. So what the Trump administration is going to be hearing from Russia is that they want guarantees of Ukrainian neutrality. They want substantial demilitarization of Ukraine. They want language and religious rights for Ukraine's Russian speakers. They want the cession of 4 territories, not including Crimea, which obviously they already think they have, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. And there are some people who are saying that Russia will also insist on fresh presidential elections in Ukraine in order to ensure the legitimacy of whoever signs a final peace deal. The idea here is that if Zelensky is forced to sign a peace deal that is not sufficiently favorable to Ukraine, hypothetically, if there were new elections, somebody could run for president on a platform promising to break the agreement. So the Russians here may demand that there be new elections so that whoever wins election will have to be committed to whatever peace deal is eventually signed. I thought that's particularly interesting in light of the Trump administration hinting that it wants new elections in Ukraine, because that itself could be a kind of unilateral concession. It could be that the administration heard from the Russians that the Russians want new elections and agreed for whatever reason that that would be a good thing, either because they themselves thought it would be a good idea or because they thought it was a costless concession to give to Russia to show good faith on the negotiation. However you want to interpret it, though, I'm extremely skeptical that Ukraine is going to give into that. Or even if they did, that it would result in a new government that really acted or behaved any differently than the current Zelensky administration. So that's where we are roughly with peace negotiations. Not a lot of details yet. And if it goes according to how I think it'll go, it's probably not going to go much of anywhere. And I suspect the Trump administration is eventually going to have to settle for some superficial bullshit, maybe like a 1-month ceasefire or something, and then a resumption of fighting later that it can blame on whomever is most convenient for them. So some other random signals that I didn't really know how to categorize. There was, and I guess is an ongoing meeting in Brussels between European leaders discussing the situation in Ukraine and also discussing increases in defense spending. I think we talked a little bit about it last time, but Germany just had elections. The Conservative Party won, not a surprise really. And the leader, Merz, is basically promising significant increases in defense spending. And he's trying to, along with other, more hawkish leaders in Europe, are meeting in Brussels to try to push the continent as a whole to significantly invest in more defense spending. And they're talking about various approaches and ways to raise money to make that happen, basically. There was a report that Trump officials met with opposition leaders in Ukraine. And there was some conspiracy theorizing that maybe the administration was trying to conspire with opposition figures to get a new government that was maybe more amenable and conciliatory to American views on the peace negotiations. However, it was then pointed out that the US government has been meeting with opposition leaders in Ukraine since the war started, semi-regularly, and that the meeting could have easily just been an extension of that. So could go either way, not entirely clear. I'm inclined to think it's just a continuation that people are reading too much into, but I can't really argue it any more than I could argue that it's the administration, going after Zelensky. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind going forward. That's evidence in favor of breaking with Ukraine and pressuring Zelensky out. potentially.
Interesting that we have a bunch of high charisma world leaders in this particular scuffle, where Zelensky is also a TV man. So he knows TV tactics on a certain level because that's how he grew up. And people are like, wow, didn't you know Zelensky used to be a comedian and involved in this stuff? Yeah, well, welcome to the club. There's a lot of showmanship going on here. But it also means that they're both less vulnerable to each other's antics because they know that there is a charade that's going on at the same time. There's the governance, which is very dry and boring, and no one wants to talk about it on big TV. And then there's personalities acting things out and showing force and showing power and showing social dominance. And there's the wrestle for that. And that's what's being fought over a lot of times more than actual, okay, what's our aid package this year? What's our aid format that we're going for? Where's the aid going? What assurances have you given the American government that this money is well spent? That kind of stuff. Like, they aren't detailed conversations really that really get into those minutia that are really important for actually closing a deal and making something happen. But the average human loves gossip and doesn't have time for that level of depth, that level of bureaucracy. So we're in an interesting, very TV-oriented political time. Where in the past, it was almost more radio because you hardly ever saw your president pre-TV. You heard him for a while, and then they were written about before then. So now your ability to banter and your ability to captivate an audience and to win them over to your side, which is kind of like the one of the ways that debates are decided. You've got a couple schools of debate, and Kukio and us have talked about this before, of the English style of debate is more so there's clearly a victor and clearly a loser based on some judges. Whereas for a lot of American debates, more so it's the response of the audience of overall who is more sold by what side, because those can yield different outcomes. Sometimes the person who's higher charisma but might not be intellectually correct on an issue can still win in a debate just because the crowd loves hearing what they have to say, and what they have to say makes more sense and galvanizes them more. So it's a whole metagame of like, how do you decide what a legit debate victory is? Is a debate victory when you have a greater percentage of the mob, or when the experts consider you to be technically correct? Those are two different assessments, and most humans kind of fall more so in the mob mentality category. Not dissing us, it's just how we tend to frame leadership and social power structure and try to hold people accountable. These are very complex systems compared to what we're evolved to deal with. So good guy, bad guy makes sense to us. Big guy, small guy makes sense to us. Like, those very simple assessments are what we boil things down to a lot of times.
And it doesn't help that the bureaucratic side of things is very opaque.
Yeah.
So the ability to really see into it, even if you're paying a lot of attention. So that leaves lots of room for people to get the wrong idea, to misinterpret events, and to basically write a choose your own adventure story that is as dramatic as possible.
Mm-hmm.
You can see Reddit comments for an example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Let's see, a couple more items here. Trump threatened sanctions on Russia in the past few days if they don't agree to peace. Not really clear what's on the table in that regard. You know, Russia's already heavily sanctioned, so some ideas pointed out by the article. Potential sanctions on Chinese banks trading in Russian oil. They have not really been sanctioned yet. The Biden administration went more after basically third-party traders, not really third-party traders. At the end of the Biden administration, they went after ships, basically the shadow fleet trading in Russian oil. And then they also earlier had tried to impose a price cap, quote unquote, basically by targeting insurers and trying to get them to only insure the oil up to a certain point. It was a whole complicated scheme that they implemented so that they could try to avoid just blanket sanctions on Russian oil, because a lot of European countries still needed it while they were transitioning to alternatives. So going hard after Chinese banks trading in Russian oil could be effective because China imports a good chunk of the oil. that Russia no longer trades to Europe and that has been diverted since to places like India and China. Another possibility, sanctions on all Russian banks. You might think that all Russian banks have already been sanctioned. Not so. Sanctions on the Russian financial sector were never complete. They cut them off. They cut a number of the largest ones off from the international payments system, the SWIFT banking system. But there were others that were allowed to continue access. And they did that partly because they wanted to leave some room for escalation later, to try to give threats, some credibility. Because early on they were trying to kind of pressure Russia into, giving ground and agreeing to some kind of peace deal or some concessions, whatnot, that obviously never went anywhere. Part of it also is that they didn't want to overly punish, again, European countries that traded with Russia, since there was a lot of trade there, so they didn't want to kind of completely cut them off. So there is room for more sanctions on Russia's financial sector, and it could be that the administration moves in that direction if Russia does not show enough willingness to come to the table and agree to a peace deal. So again, these are just hypotheticals as to what further sanctions might look like. I would point out that the Trump administration has also threatened to tariff Russia if they don't come to the table, for peace and agree to a peace deal. But none of these threats are especially credible. For one, Russia has kind of already fortified its financial system. They had started doing that after 2014 because of sanctions that were placed on them then, and in the expectation that there would be further sanctions, since they knew that they were not going to back down. So their system was already relatively resilient by the time the 2022 conflict broke out, and they've been adjusting and adapting since then. So further sanctions will hurt, but they've already got kind of alternative mechanisms in place to circumvent them, so shouldn't be too much trouble. And then Russia doesn't hardly export anything to the United States, even before the war. So tariffs don't mean anything to them. That's just an empty threat, pretty much. And then the final item in the other signals category here, suspension of the DoD's Cyber Command offensive cyber operations targeting Russia. So it's not entirely clear why this happened. Again, it could be tied into the peace negotiations, or it could just be the Secretary of Defense doing something on his own. But the only important note that I had here that I think is important to keep in mind is that this does not affect the CIA or the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The caveat is that the Trump administration has rolled back other efforts at the FBI and other agencies relating to countering digital and cyber threats. But from what I read, those efforts were mostly focused on misinformation rather than full-on hackers. So it seems like while the Department of Defense has stopped offensive operations, the CIA and other agencies that engage in offensive cyber operations have not been affected. It could be that they have been affected by their own agency heads suspending operations, and we just haven't heard about it yet. The CIA doesn't really publicize its operations that much for obvious reasons. But I haven't read anything to the effect that they or other related agencies engaged in this kind of activity have suspended their operations. So this could just be the DoD here. And I don't know how important the DoD's offensive operations would necessarily be relative to the CIA. I don't really know how the division of labor breaks down on that. But this is not a full suspension. You can think of this as being more of a partial suspension in offensive cyber operations. The bigger question, though, is, again, why? That we don't really know yet. Let's see. While we're talking about Ukraine, and before we get to the trade war stuff, there's just a couple other things that I kind of wanted to talk about briefly. So, one of the things we've seen in the war in Ukraine is the evolution of new military technologies, specifically and mostly drones. So it can be worth it to kind of keep tabs on developments therein, because they're going to be relevant to the future of warfare in general, not just in Eastern Europe. So just a couple of the things that have kind of emerged in the past year that are worth pointing out. One is the emergence of air superiority drones. Drones have been used to blow up soldiers, blow up tanks, et cetera, basically in a ground attack role. So it was only a matter of time then before, well, obviously there have been countermeasures to that, mostly in the realm of electronic warfare. But there was the question of whether or not you could use drones to shoot down other drones or to bring them down somehow. And not a lot of traction on that in the first 2 years or 3 years or so. But in the past year, there's been actual traction. You have seen the emergence of drones that have specialized in taking down other drones. The technology is still very rudimentary. For example, for the most part, they just fly into the other drone and knock them down. I haven't seen any yet that have had their own explosives, for example, that are designed to destroy the other drone. But it is happening. Air superiority drones are a thing. That is an emergent now technology. And most likely there's going to be further development on that in conjunction with further development of anti-drone electronic warfare technology, which is also rapidly developing. Another thing that's happened with drones in the past year, and I thought this was very weird, but it makes a lot of sense, drones that are controlled via fiber optic cable. So of course, drones are known for being remotely piloted, but with electronic warfare, you can jam the signal. And depending on the strength of the signal used to control the drone, that could be very effective. That is to say, the jamming can be very effective and can basically deny you access to certain parts of the battlefield. So to get around the jamming problem, what you can do is you can just plug a cable directly into the drone and have the cable go back to your command post where you're flying the drone, and then you don't have to worry about jamming. It's basically impossible at that point to jam. And so there is actually video of these fiber optic cables kind of strung out across broad stretches of battlefield where these attack drones have been launched, and just dragged the cable behind them. And then the final one I had here, anti-maritime drone. That is to say a maritime drone that is designed to destroy other maritime drones. So these have been used and developed by Russia in the past year to try to counter the threat posed by Ukraine's maritime drones, which famously have been used since the war started to basically deny Ukraine's littoral, deny access to Ukraine's littoral to the Russian Navy, which has had to withdraw significantly from its forward position that it had assumed at the beginning of the conflict. So just some items there worth pointing out. A couple other points, some stuff from the past year, actually from the past couple months. Let's see. So Ukraine is shifting to a core-based model. This is the Ukrainian army shifting to a core-based model that had been brigade-based. But that was creating problems because basically during some of the bigger battles, you need more than brigade-sized units. So rather than having corps organize that, they would just take brigades and then just attach more and more units to them. The result being that you had these giant engorged brigades, which were very impractical to control with just a brigade-sized command. I forget the technical term, but basically, the command staff for a brigade is not sufficient for the outsized brigades that were being created, and so now they're shifting over to a core model, so in order to deal with that problem. And then also the Ukrainian army has announced that they're not going to form new units going forward. This was a source of significant criticism of the past year in particular from the analytical community. What the Ukrainians had been doing is drafting new soldiers, training them, and then trying to form whole new units with them, and then sending them into combat. That was a pretty bad idea because it meant that you had whole new units with no experience at all going up against experienced Russian units that would generally mop the floor with them. Also, these new units generally suffered disproportionately from desertion. So what they're going to do instead is what they probably should have been doing from the start, and what analysts have been suggesting, which is to take new recruits, be they volunteers or conscripts, and try to fill holes in existing units. And that way you get experienced units, which have the benefit of experience, but which also have more manpower. Before, the most experienced units were also the ones that were kind of suffering the most from shortages because they weren't getting enough reinforcements. So this way they get the reinforcements, and then the raw recruits have the benefit of exposure to guys that actually know what they're doing and can help them out. And hopefully that'll also help with the desertion problem, since one of the causes of desertion is just lack of confidence in the command, lack of confidence in the unit. If they're around people who can kind of give them more confidence by way of their experience, that'll hopefully reduce the temptation to just run off. So that's it for Ukraine. Just to kind of summarize, it's entirely possible the administration wants to just dump the issue and is just trying to angle Ukraine so that they're in a position where they can't refuse whatever peace negotiation, whatever peace deal is negotiated with Russia. And then, the United States can just wash their hands of the issue and hand it off to Europe and let them deal with it however they want. But I still think that a lot of the pressure that the administration is bringing to bear is going to get reversed later. I have in my mind a vision of the administration doing a complete 180 and then just surprising everybody. Not because it's the right thing to do, not because I have faith in them, just because that's what they've done before on any number of issues. And I don't see any reason why this would necessarily be different. I think Trump probably does want some kind of progress towards peace, but I still don't think he really cares enough to really invest in it enough to make it happen, especially given that it would be very costly and would require risk on the part of the United States. So I still say kayfabe. I'm going to be stubborn on this until conclusively proven otherwise. But I'm open to the fact that I could be entirely wrong on that. So we'll see. Actually, that's a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I am not an expert on everything I talk about on here, more painfully obvious at some times than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. Participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody, so please do chip in. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do appreciate the feedback.
Appreciate you, Twitch chat. Thanks for hanging out.
So let's see. Trade war. So yeah, there's lots of stuff going on with the tariffs in the past week. And baffling is the word I would use. Like I said last week, I thought it would be theater, and that, like with the tariff threats at the end of January, that it would mostly come to nothing. And some of Trump's core supporters thought, he would go all the way. Certainly some of his core critics also thought he would go all the way. There's lots of people kind of panicking. So between the two, between those two perspectives, nobody was right. He ended up kind of going with this weird third direction. And I'm not the only one who thinks it's weird, because markets had it priced in that he was bluffing, that it was just negotiating. And markets were not pleased with the direction he went. Again, we'll get into the details, but just in general, even analysts, experienced traders, like everybody who has stake in this game is just utterly confused, and nobody knows what to make of it. Doesn't necessarily surprise me in so much as that it reflects a lack of planning on the part of the administration. But yeah, I'm at pains to kind of explain, even within the administration's own internal logic, what it is they think they're doing here. So for those of you who have been under a rock for the past week, what happened is that on Tuesday, the threatened tariffs that the administration had been trying to bully Canada and Mexico and China with actually did come into effect. Not necessarily surprising in and of itself. It's not necessarily the case that theater has to be restricted to inaction. It's entirely possible for him to threaten to do something as part of theater and then to actually do it for a while and then to walk it back when he gets whatever it was he actually wanted. So still, everybody was very surprised when he actually did it, went forward with it, and then there didn't seem to be any clear pathway to walk them back. So for a good 48 hours, everybody was kind of borderline panicking because of this. So let's see. Do you want to get into like the impacts of the tariffs, or do you just want to kind of go through the review of the week's events first?
Are there any impacts of the tariffs?
Oh yeah. It's a long list, man.
Okay. Yeah, might as well.
All right. Now this is not going to be a complete, like, comprehensive review of the impacts, and some of this is stuff that's gonna happen and hasn't happened yet. And there's also a whole other set of notes I had from the end of January talking about the potential impact of tariffs. I didn't have time to integrate that into this new list of impacts for these most recent of tariffs. And that's not because I haven't spent time trying. I actually went out of my way to start trying to clean up and organize my notes here at 4:30 p.m. today. And I was still doing it just before we started. So just hours and hours today trying to clean all this shit up, and I still haven't had enough time. So there's plenty that I'm not going to get to here. So, just to go through it here, what I do have, what are some of the impacts of the recently imposed tariffs? And I want to point out too that part of what happened later this past week is a walking back of some of the tariffs. So some of the stuff isn't going to happen. But it's just to walk through what a 25% blanket tariff on Canada and Mexico is going to do for all parties involved. For one, I should also point out this is going to partly include China, but I think mostly it's Mexico and Canada. The tariffs on China actually apply to computers, toys, and smartphones. And that's notable because those categories actually got an exemption from tariffs in the first Trump administration. So if you think that tariffs aren't a big deal because they didn't impact you much in the first Trump administration, so why worry about them this time? Keep in mind that there were loads of exemptions back then. And some of them, including on some things like, again, computers, toys, smartphones, do not exist this time. So if you're buying, Christmas stuff or birthdays, presents for kids, this is going to impact you. If you want to upgrade your computer, like I want to, then this is going to impact you. God damn it. And of course, if you want to upgrade your phone, buy a new smartphone, whatever, this also impacts you. So broad category of people that's going to encompass. And it's about to get broader, as you'll see. So corn. 60% of all corn exports to Mexico from the United States were by train last year. 40% of those train movements originated in Illinois, according to U.S. government data. So Illinois in particular is going to feel disruptions because it's a major exporter of corn into Mexico. 36% of total U.S. corn export commitments are for sales to Mexico in the marketing year that ends in August, So again, Mexico, a major agricultural market for the United States. Big disruptions there mean big disruptions to the bottom line for any number of agricultural communities in the United States, and in particular corn producers, which are concentrated in the Midwest. So farmers are also going to be hurt by fertilizer prices. So to run through this real quick, many U.S. farmers have to add potassium to their soil, and they use potash to do that. Well, the U.S. imports lots of its potash from Canada. Mostly it comes from Saskatchewan. I have in my notes here, 90% of U.S. imports of potash that is used by farmers anyway. Oh, sorry. The U.S. imports 90% of the potash that its farmers use, and 80% of that comes from Canada. There we go. And the article in question noted that potash cannot be replaced with domestic production. It just doesn't exist. Canadian farmers, for their part, add lots of phosphorus to their soils, most of which they buy from producers in Florida. So they're also going to be impacted by disruptions in this vein. More on fertilizer. Fertilizer is most farmers' largest input cost, about 22%, according to the Department of Agriculture. And the price of potash has risen from $303 per short ton January 3rd to $348 on February 28th. And that was just ahead of the tariffs, with markets trying to price in the risk of tariffs. It's probably risen even more since then. Phosphate prices have also been rising, although apparently it's a little hard to estimate. That doesn't really have as much to do with tariffs as it does with the hurricanes, I should say, that hit Florida. Let's see, impact. So a full pass-through of the 25% tariff could increase prices by more than $100 per ton for potash supplies sourced from Canada. That's according to some university study. It's not going to result in shortages. That is to say, the tariffs should not result in shortages of potash. So everybody who wants fertilizer should still be able to get it, even with the disruption. The issue is that there's going to be price hikes. There was one fertilizer company executive who warned U.S. farmers that they should be prepared for fertilizer prices to jump as much as 25%. As for alternatives, there's not really any. As far as potash, the main alternative is producers in Russia and Belarus. You can probably guess that that's not really viable for obvious reasons. Sanctions and whatnot, principally. As for phosphate, the other main producers like Morocco are kind of far away, and apparently it's difficult to source from them. So that's not really viable either. So the result of all this is just big increases in costs for farmers, which of course is going to have knock-on effects for inflation of agricultural produce for consumers in both Canada and the United States. So that's fertilizer. Fuel. So fuel is a big one because a lot of refineries in the United States, especially in the northeastern United States, actually depend on Canadian oil. That is to say, the refineries are specifically designed for the kind of light crude that is produced by Canada. So if they want to find an alternative to Canadian crude, they actually can't, because there's not any American producers of that kind of light crude that can be used by the refineries, because again, custom designed for that sort of crude. So the result of any increase in prices stemming from tariffs is just going to be higher prices at the pump, basically. There's just not a viable alternative. If you wanted to refine oil not using Canadian crude, you would have to build whole new refineries in the Northeast to replace the ones you currently have. And that's going to take like 10 years. So that's not viable in the short term. So this will be very inflationary as far as fuel costs go. In addition, although caveat being that that's mostly going to be concentrated in places like the Northeast and Midwest of the United States. Let's see. Cars. So automobiles have been a major negotiating sticking point as far as trade. Tariffs obviously will be very disruptive to that. What was it? I had a number from S&P Global. They estimate that the new duties on imports from Mexico and Canada could cost affected U.S. car makers an average 10 to 25% of their annual earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. I know that's kind of a weird statistic for a lot of people who maybe aren't familiar with accounting, but that's basically profits. There's lots of different measurements for profits. EBITDA is like a big one because it takes into account not only your costs of production, but also a lot of kind of ephemeral costs like taxes, depreciation, kind of abstract stuff. So losing 10 to 25% of your EBITDA, that is a big deal, because those are basically like your core earnings. To give you some more context on that, they estimate it could cost General Motors about $14 billion, which is basically all of their EBITDA for this year, or what is projected for this year. And then Ford, it could cost them about $6 billion, which is around 70% of the EBITDA projected for this year. So it's going to be very costly for car companies to not be able to import cars from Canada or Mexico. And I don't have it in my notes here, but I should. That's probably in the other set of notes from the end of January. These tariffs are not just on cars, they're also going to be on car parts. And a lot of the car parts that are used in American cars are produced in low-cost factories in either Canada or Mexico. And it's worth pointing out that those parts themselves have their own complex supply chains. And very frequently, those car parts actually cross the border multiple times. So it's not like there's going to be a 25% tariff on just an individual, car. It's going to be the 25% tariff on the car, and then also a 25% tariff on each individual component in the car, and then each individual subcomponent within those components. Oof. All of those tariffs stack on each other.
Oof.
So this isn't going to be just a 25% flat increase on the price of a car. It's going to be more than that. And the fact that car parts and even cars cross the border multiple times means that it's going to be even higher than all of that. So this is a pretty steep penalty for car companies to face in their supply chain. And keep in mind that it's not easy to just set up a new factory to produce car parts within the United States. It takes several years to find land, buy land, get a process engineer to design everything you need, buy everything you need, build the factory, set it up, hire people, get all of the finances sorted out. Like, you're talking like a 5-year commitment, roughly, at least. So this isn't something that's going to be sorted out in the short term. Like, even if you think that all of this stuff is going to result in more reshoring into the United States and American manufacturing returning to form, even if you think all of that, it's going to take a lot of time. And in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of inflation that results from this, as well as a big hit to car companies' bottom lines. Now, I don't think any of that is going to happen anyway. I mean, I don't think anybody looks at the United States right now and thinks, oh, yeah, I definitely want to invest in billions of dollars worth of factory stuff right now. There's too much uncertainty to really make that economically viable. Everybody is going to take a wait and see approach to all this, because it's entirely possible that in 4 years there's a new administration that comes in and says, yeah, fuck all of that, we're going back to free trade. And then all of that money that you spent investing in new factories in the United States was wasted, because now you're just going to go back to the low-cost producers in Mexico and Canada. So uncertainty means that investing is kind of a fool's game right now. You know, unless you're willing to take on a lot of risk, most likely there's not going to be a lot of traction towards reshoring or just investment of any kind until people in the investment community have more certainty as to what America's trade policy looks like, what its objectives are, and what they can expect. Acting crazy can have some benefits in unfucking some very difficult international issues. But when it comes to trade, certainty is what you need. You need to be able to convey that, because otherwise the major actors are not going to play ball with you. And that's most likely what we're going to see come out of all this. So automotive companies, very much fucked from this, even more so than the other categories we'll talk about. Housing. So tariffs are going to impact the importation of appliances, electronics, cabinets, and fixtures, all of which are used in the either construction or in the, let's say, decoration of houses. And so in that sense, it's going to cost you more to kind of fill up your house with stuff or to build it in the first place. And this is coming on top of difficulties in the housing market already, because they say that they're already facing higher costs from commodity prices, labor, and freight costs. So aeronautics, Canada is a top market for the export of American aeronautic equipment and aircraft. Obviously, having a big tariff in place is going, well, Canada is going to impose retaliatory tariffs. That's where the issue is going to be for American exports. But the tariffs are going to have a similar impact on the aeronautics industry as they're going to have on the automobile industry, which is that Canadian producers produce a lot of equipment that is used to make American planes. And so this is going to fuck with the supply chain for American aircraft producers. Some of the specific examples I had were Canadians produce some landing gear. What was it? Canadian manufacturers produce engines for General Dynamics, Gulfstream, and Textron, as well as landing gear for Boeing and Airbus. So I don't know that Canadian producers are as deep into these kinds of aeronautic supply chains as they are in, say, the American automotive supply chains, but it will have an effect. And again, this isn't something that you can just change on a dime. It takes years and years to build up a new factory. So most likely this is just going to cause inflation and cut into the bottom line for aircraft manufacturers. Aluminum. So this kind of ties, we've talked about steel and aluminum before. This was one of the big ones that happened in the first term of the Trump administration. To kind of recap that, basically, yes, you could get more jobs by having a more protectionist stance on steel and aluminum, but steel and aluminum is a major input for any number of other manufacturing firms and industries. And by engaging in protectionism, you're going to drive up the input costs for all of those industries, and you're going to lose a lot more jobs in those industries than you'll gain in steel or aluminum. So that's the bad trade-off being made there. So more recently here, and this is the only reason I noted here, the leading aluminum producer in the United States, Alcoa, actually released a statement regarding Trump's plan to impose a tariff, and they said that it could cost 100,000 US jobs, and that the tariff would not itself be enough to entice Alcoa to boost production in the United States. So that's Alcoa itself, which stands to benefit from higher aluminum prices, saying that it doesn't really want the tariff unless there's more that can be done to encourage investment in the United States, because as is, they're going to lose more business from this than they're going to gain, and lose, in turn, more money than they'll gain from tariffs, again, quote, as they are now, end quote. Let's see, general impact. What was this? This was economists at Nationwide estimated that tariffs against the nation's 3 major trade partners would increase the costs of goods per household by nearly $1,000 annually. And they predicted that consumer prices would increase. Oh, sorry, this is something that already happened. Consumer prices increased 3% year on year in January, the largest gain in 7 months. Some of that is just because of pre-existing inflation. Some of it probably due to supply disruptions, but some of it is going to be due to market actors pricing in the risk from tariffs, since they didn't know at that point whether or not they were going to happen. So given now that they have happened, partially, and will likely happen again, given the administration's behavior thus far, that inflation is probably going to be baked in, which could create problems later. Let's see, food service / accommodation. There are some businesses in the accommodation and food services sector that are reporting that, quote, tariff actions have created chaos in information and pricing measures, forecasting, and forward buys, which serves to artificially inflate purchases to be followed by a drop-off, end quote. So even they are having trouble here, even though the services sector is a little more insulated from trade stuff. They're also impacted by this. Because, of course, they buy lots of stuff that is imported and whatnot, and that's disrupting pricing, disrupting procurement, etc. Education, interestingly. Let's see, there were some providers of educational services who said they were, quote, still digesting the current potential changes with federal assistance programs, end quote. That's not necessarily directly to do with tariffs. That's kind of tangential, but even education is kind of being buffeted here. Why did I add that? That's probably in the wrong place in the notes.
Yeah, on perfect notes, but no one's notes really are.
All right, food services, construction. Let's see, similar sentiments in the construction industry. Implementation of tariffs will have a significant cost impact, blah, 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 obviously. Construction industry already seeing prices rise in anticipation. The financial sector, I should say. So there's already been significant fallout in the financial sector. Stocks mostly have taken the hit, but thus far it's mostly been small and medium caps that have been hit. Large caps, not so much. And then as for sector, what I was reading was that tech, industrial, and financial sector stocks have been disproportionately impacted. Other parts of the financial sector have benefited. Basically, safer securities have seen a big influx, because obviously stocks are kind of fucked right now until people can figure out what's going on with American trade policy. So money market funds have seen a big influx, bonds have seen a big influx, and then also short to intermediate investment grade funds, general domestic taxable fixed income funds, and municipal debt funds have also seen a big uptick in buys on account of the uncertainty. So again, this is basically just what happens when there's more risk perceived in the market. They move away from relatively risky securities and move into relatively safer ones. So generally that means away from stocks and towards things like bonds. Retaliation. So, as you might expect, after the tariffs were imposed, China, Canada, and the US all imposed their own retaliatory tariffs. My notes are a little sparse on this one. There's more in the other set. I'll try to have them for next time, but for now, China, for its part, hiked import levies covering about $21 billion worth of American agricultural and food products. And they also said there's going to be additional tariffs of 10 to 15% on certain U.S. imports from starting March 10th, I guess tomorrow. They did not really specify in the article what, quote unquote, certain U.S. imports would consist of, but I guess we're about to find out.
This just all sounds like agreeing to make stuff more expensive for each other.
That's exactly what it is.
Where's the benefit? Who's winning this? Like, what?
Well, I mean, if somebody puts tariffs on you, then that's going to hurt your exporters, and it's going to benefit the other country's exporters. Mm-hmm. And so that's unfair for your exporters, so you want to even the playing field by raising your own tariffs. So this is why it takes a lot of negotiations to mutually reduce tariffs so that everybody is on something resembling an even playing field.
Mm-hmm. Like free trade.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Canada, for its part, announced immediate 25% tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth. That's $28 billion worth of U.S. imports. And they say that there's the potential to target an additional 125 billion Canadian dollars worth of U.S. imports within 21 days, if necessary. So an immediate hit, and then signaling a potential further hit if there's not improvement. Now, the United States government, for its part, says that, and this is Trump specifically speaking, said that the U.S. would match any retaliatory tariffs with corresponding further increases on top of existing U.S. tariffs. So basically threatening them not to retaliate, which of course is not going to work. But again, that's the Trump administration style, so no shock. Mexico also rolled out some of its own retaliatory tariffs. I don't have them here in front of me, so I can't go through them. But I do know they exist. But I think they, as well as Canada's retaliatory tariffs, have mostly been suspended now on account of subsequent developments. So that brings us to this past week's developments, as promised. Let's see, retaliation. Yeah. So after the tariffs were implemented, I was looking pretty quickly to see signals from the administration regarding what the counterparties could do to end the tariffs, since that's basically what they had done at the end of January. And there actually were some signals in that vein. The Secretary of Commerce, Lutnick, said that deals with Canada and Mexico could be announced as early as Wednesday, which is actually what ended up happening. He was talking on Fox Business in that interview. And he said, quote, Trump was, quote, considering offering relief to some companies and was going to work something out, end quote. Also, quote, it's not going to be a pause, none of that pause stuff, lol, but I think he's going to figure out you do more and I'll meet you in the middle some way, end quote. He also gave a hint that there would be some rules of origin stuff, which also is what ended up happening. He was also on the TV again on Bloomberg TV on Wednesday, saying that there could be potential relief specifically for the automotive industry. So let's see, skipping ahead, a phone call in which Trump says he told Justin Trudeau that his country is not doing it. Oh yeah, right. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let me just move that down a little bit here. Yeah, so that's where we were. There was some early signals on Tuesday and Wednesday that the administration would walk some of these back, and then Wednesday came, and correspondingly, there were exemptions announced. So at first, it was just the automotive industry. And the administration's spokeswoman, Caroline Leavitt, said that there would be a 1-month exemption, and that the administration was giving it to ensure that U.S. automakers would not be at an economic disadvantage. So the idea there is that if there's just tariffs on Canada, that is to say on cars from Canada, but not cars imported from other countries, then that would put the automotive industry in the United States at a disadvantage. And so they wanted to wait until next month when the reciprocal tariffs are supposed to be implemented. And presumably that's going to impact, all exporters of cars to the United States rather than just Canada. So the automotive industry lobbied for that, and the administration bought it. And so they got the exemption here. Now, that exemption only extended to cars. It did not extend to car parts, which led to further lobbying on their part. We'll get to that. The second, okay, so thus began negotiations with the leaders of Mexico and Canada. Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, called Donald Trump. They had a talk. Apparently, they talked a lot about dairy for some reason. That's a pre-existing trading cleavage between the United States and Canada that goes back many decades. Apparently, Trump swore at Trudeau. That was mentioned in multiple articles, but there was no details about what specifically they talked about other than the dairy. There was one detail, though. There was apparently fentanyl brought up. Apparently, Trump told Trudeau that Canada wasn't doing enough to stop fentanyl smuggling, which is totally baffling, again, as we've discussed before, because there's hardly any fentanyl that comes into the United States from Canada. So I have to assume that's just the Trump administration bullshitting again and trying to pressure Canada into doing something they don't want to do. So that was the call with Prime Minister Trudeau. There was also a call between Trump and the president of Mexico, a certain Mrs. Scheinbaum. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, the call with Scheinbaum went much better. She apparently was able to sweet talk Trump. We've discussed before that flattery is like the best way to handle him. And she apparently was able to convince Trump to ease up on the tariffs by pointing out stats on fentanyl seizures that the Mexican government has made over the past month. And I guess that was enough because it seemed to work. So after these two phone calls on Friday, the administration announced, in addition to the exemption for the automotive industry, new limited suspensions of tariffs on Mexico and then later Canada for a month, which would only apply to goods covered by the USMCA agreement, which I'm going to try to call CUSMA from now on because that's just much easier to say. I'll get to that in a second. There's some weird lore there. But basically, it's not a full suspension of tariffs. There's a range of goods that are, what's the word I want, that are eligible for lower tariffs under America's free trade agreements with Mexico and Canada if they meet what are called rules of origin requirements. And basically, these just require that a certain proportion of the goods be made in the actual partner country. And these rules are in place to make sure that countries with free trade agreements with the United States don't just import goods from abroad and then sell them into the United States to get around higher tariffs for those countries. If you want lower tariffs as part of the free trade deal, it has to be made in the actual partner country, or at least a certain percentage of it. So Trump could have given a full delay on the tariffs, which would have made more sense to me. But instead, he said that only goods that qualify under the rules of origin of CUSMA get the exemption. Everything else will still be affected by the tariffs. Very strange decision. You could argue it makes sense because, you only want goods covered by the free trade deal coming in. But keep in mind, there's still a lot of stuff that comes into the United States from Mexico and Canada that does not qualify under CUSMA. And that includes car parts. You might think that would be covered completely by the agreement, but it's actually not. And the reason is that the rules of origin as written in CUSMA are actually somewhat ambiguous. It's actually kind of hard to verify whether given goods produced in Mexico and Canada actually do qualify under the rules, just the way they're written. And so what that means is that rather than taking the risk of potentially, getting a negative ruling later that screws you in court, a lot of car companies actually just don't bother applying for the lower tariffs and just pay them anyway. Pay the standard tariff, the non-CUSMA tariff that was in place before CUSMA. And that means that with this exemption only covering rules of origin eligible goods, a lot of automotive companies and other companies producing other parts will actually still be affected by it. So it's not the reprieve that you might think it is. Ford, General Motors, all these American car companies, they're actually still going to be hit by this. It won't be as bad as a full-on tariff without any exemptions, but it's still going to fuck with their bottom line. It's still going to snarl up their supply chains a bit. And I imagine that they're screaming bloody murder to anybody who will listen in the administration to give them further exemptions, full exemptions like what were offered at the end of January. Now, as a postscript on Canada's retaliatory tariffs, I should have had this with the other retaliatory stuff. Canada did delay its own retaliatory tariffs until the 2nd of April as a result of the reprieve given by the Trump administration. However, the province of Ontario, which is responsible for exporting electricity into certain US states, has said that the surcharge, that is to say, the increase in the price of the electricity that it sells to the United States, that they had promised in retaliation for US tariffs, they say that's still going to happen. So the province of Ontario is not backing down, and they say that they're still going to charge more going forward. Let's see. So that's where we are with retaliation. Some signals more recently on other tariffs. So the Secretary of the Treasury made some statements that are relevant here. He gave a speech at the Economic Club of New York, and he suggested, is what I have here, that when reciprocal tariffs are implemented a month from now, it's going to kick off a series of trade negotiations with countries around the world, which suggests, again, that the tariffs are not the end point. You know, they're not what the administration actually wants. What they want is concessions. They want to try to scare other countries into doing something for them. Whether or not that something is substantive or not really clear. But the statement here suggests that this is meant to be the beginning of a negotiation. So another point for Team Kayfabe there. As far as tariffs on the EU and the UK, which have been threatened previously, the Secretary of the Treasury gave some glimpse of what discussions on tariffs with the UK and EU might look like. Specifically, he focused on taxes on tech firms that Europe and Britain have imposed in recent years, you know, Digital Rights Act, etc. We talked about that last time, that probably the administration would really home in on trying to defend tech companies in trade negotiations with Europe. Let's see. And then also, I thought this was kind of funny. The Treasury Secretary suggested to foreign leaders that they should keep their cool when negotiating with Donald Trump. And in that vein, he offered unusually pointed criticism of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Quote, if you want to be a numbskull like Justin Trudeau and say, oh, we're going to do this, then tariffs are probably going to go up, end quote.
He called them a dumb skull?
Yeah, he called him a numbskull. Okay. So, you know, this once again reaffirms that if you want to deal with Trump, that, you know, the best way to do it is to be very flattering, very obsequious, you know, being very deferential, etc. And that if you don't, then you're going to get more heat than you would otherwise. I might also point out that this kind of also suggests that the whole thing is kayfabe, because the administration is basically saying here, you know, this official in the administration is saying that if you play ball and don't make the president look bad or, you know, challenge him, then you'll be treated better than otherwise. Not much mention there of actual substantive goals for the administration being achieved. Just participate in the theater and we will leave you alone. So in the past few days, there's been lots more drama. Peter Navarro kind of magically appeared out of nowhere. I didn't even think he was part of the administration. To give you some background on that, I thought that Peter Navarro was not going to be in the new administration, and that Wilbur Ross, who had been kind of a rival to Peter Navarro in the first Trump administration, might have a role, but that he later on it was revealed that he would not. You know, basically there was questioning that he would, there was evidence that he would, and then it turned out not to be true. So that was relevant because it suggested that the most hawkish trade figure in the first term of the Trump administration, Navarro, would not be in it at all. And Ross, who was relatively more dovish, would be. And then that led me to believe that maybe the administration would be relatively more dovish on trade this time in the second term. And that was reinforced again when Ross did not end up getting any position at all. And instead, a lot of the trade positions went to Wall Street guys who were known for being big-time investors. So getting that kind of crowd, which is very much an establishment crowd, into the trade offices of one kind or another, that suggested to me, and especially dovish administration on trade was coming in. Relative for Trump, obviously, he was going to be hawkish to some degree. regardless. But the absence of Navarro and Wall Street executives in the administration, I thought was evidence they weren't going to go as hard in that direction. So instead, the administration has gone increasingly hard since it's been in office. And then here's Peter Navarro, who it turns out actually does have a position in the administration. It's a pretty minor position. It's something to do, it's like a Bureau of Industry and Trade or something weird like that. It's not as high ranking a position as the one he had in the first administration, which was like a senior advisory role, if I remember correctly. But Navarro was in the news, and he was in the news for a couple of things. Let me see. Well, for one, he went onto TV and said that U.S. negotiators should, one, discuss reworking the border with Canada, and two, that the United States should expel Canada from the Five Eyes intelligence sharing network. Now, he has since denied the claim that, he said that, which I don't get, but whatever. These are pretty hardline positions, and they don't really even have much to do with trade, which is why I think he's just huffing and puffing to try to improve the American negotiating position. Again, Trump's whole thing is scaring other countries or even just other people into doing what he wants, or maybe not even necessarily into doing what he wants, but just into doing something that they would not have done otherwise. In other words, he wants to scare people into doing something for him without him even necessarily asking for something, just to see what he can get out of it. Narcissistic behavior, in a sense, which shouldn't surprise anybody at this point. Now, it's important to keep in mind here, because I know a lot of people heard that and said, oh, America is going to invade Canada. That's been a running narrative in the Canadian election and Canadian politics generally. I still maintain all of that is bullshit. I don't think the United States is going to do that. Again, I don't begrudge anybody for taking it seriously. Don't get me wrong. But that said, I still think Navarro's comments here, even if they are very incendiary, are just part and parcel of the administration's violent cheap talk. Again, not uncommon for them. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that Peter Navarro, while he is in the administration, has an outsized influence right now because a lot of other figures that are going to play a leading role in the administration's trade policy have not actually been confirmed yet, technically. So I was referring to Letnick before as the Secretary of Commerce. Technically, he hasn't been confirmed yet. So a lot of these other guys are actually much more dovish on trade, and because they're not in office yet, they don't have as much access to Trump as Navarro does right now, as somebody who is already inside. So while he can talk big and maybe have a disproportionate influence, in the longer run, that influence is probably going to wane. And as that becomes the case, as you do see more figures confirmed coming in, probably they're going to have a moderating influence. Maybe that doesn't mean much in practice. Probably the administration is still going to engage in lots of performative bullshit that is designed to agitate the shit out of everybody. But in terms of substance, they'll probably walk back a little bit and be a little less hard. We'll see. That's also speculation on my part. Anybody's guess what he actually does in practice. But as far as Navarro's comments, that's what I read. He has relatively more influence right now just because of that fact, because there's not as many other trade officials in the administration working right now. And also, he doesn't really have that much power anyway in his capacity as the head of this minor office. So, some of the fallout from that, Canada announced that it was going to withdraw from negotiations with the US over the trade issue until other figures have been confirmed by the Senate. The specific names that were brought up were Jameson Greer and Howard Letnick. Again, Letnick is supposed to be the Secretary of Commerce. Another item that came up, and I haven't really seen much confirmation of this, so I don't know how substantive it is, but it's worth mentioning. Apparently, Trump is seeking to control the Keystone XL pipeline. So for those of you not familiar with that, that was a $9 billion pipeline that is supposed to bring hundreds of thousands of barrels per day of oil from Canada into the United States. Its production was hobbled by a number of problems with approval, licensing, also shifts in the market, which made it relatively cost infeasible in the long run. And then also, the protests. Those of you maybe remember, it's been a while, like 10 years now, but there were major protests over this pipeline. I think it was in somewhere in the Dakotas, actually not far from where you are, Neuro.
I remember
They
that.
had to do with basically a Native American reservation. The company said that they had gotten permission to build through the reservation, but there was a cohort of people within the reservation who disagreed with the agreement that the reservation's leadership had made and insisted that the pipeline not be built because they were afraid of environmental concerns and whatnot. And so they started protesting, and they asked other people to come in and protesting, and it turned into a big left-wing event, basically, where there were just shit tons of people out there trying to shut down the pipeline. This was during the Obama administration, if I remember correctly. And they ended up successfully stopping the pipeline, but it actually really had more to do with changes in the market. Like I mentioned, the price of oil fell. The cost of oil production had always been high in the United States, with fracking specifically. And so eventually it was just decided that it wasn't worth the effort, and the project was largely abandoned. So I thought it was a little weird then that Trump came out and said, well, that there was an article saying anyway that Trump was interested in taking control of the pipeline. I don't think the underlying cost calculus has changed in the past 10 some years, so I don't know that there's going to be anybody actually interested in building it. So this could just be Trump, if this is actually true, trying to posture for his base. Because, of course, Republicans made a big deal about the protests and demanded that the pipeline be built, saying that it would be cheaper energy for everybody and would be good for the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So in so much as there's still people from that era that remember that, this could be Trump trying to score some points with them. We'll see. I don't know if this is going to be a substantive sticking point of the negotiations, because again, as far as I know, the pipeline was never actually built, and so there isn't really anything to sell. But he may try to make it an issue anyway. He's never been stopped by the absence of substance before, so why not this one? So the most recent stuff I had here on the whole tariff thing with Canada and Mexico has to do with potash. So we talked before about fertilizer and how potash is a major input therein, and the tariff thing has increased potash prices, and by extension fertilizer prices. So the Trump administration actually did announce recently that tariffs on potash would be reduced from 25 to 10%, specifically because of the impact on farmers. And then after that, he threatened 250% tariffs on imports of Canadian dairy. Again, that goes back to that pre-existing dairy issue in Canadian-American trade relations. If you're curious about why that's such an issue, it's because Canada has a whole state management system for its dairy. It's not really entirely private producers. There's heavy government regulation and intervention into the market. And that makes it very difficult for American producers to penetrate the market because they're not involved in the whole system of production and distribution that is basically run by the Canadian state. So the United States says, hey, that's unfair. We want you to deregulate so our producers can have fair access. And then the Canadian government invariably comes back and says, hey, this is a sovereignty issue. We're going to regulate our dairy market how you like. We prefer it this way, so back off. So that's been the back and forth for like 40 years now, basically since the end of World War II, so maybe even further back than that. There has been some push to deregulate even within Canada itself, but as you can imagine, having a hostile, aggressive foreign country pressuring you to do it doesn't really make it a good look for a politician to be seen to be giving into that. So probably there's not going to be much give there on the part of the Canadian government anytime soon. Let's see. Oh, the only other item I had here as far as trade, the administration has launched a Section 301 investigation into Chinese shipbuilding. USTR, that's the United States Trade Representative, is proposing to levy tariffs on Chinese-made ships that are worth about 1% of the value of the cargo that is offloaded from them. And that's, if implemented, would increase to 15% over time. So the idea there basically is to try to encourage investment in American shipbuilding by making it relatively more costly to use Chinese ships, if not foreign ships generally. But a lot of the ships are Chinese made, so it's the same either way. This isn't going to work. The criticism I read is that this is just going to result in a diversion of cargo from Chinese cargo ships to Korean and Japanese cargo ships. They're the other major producers of cargo ships. So they're going to be the main beneficiaries of this. So if they do want more investment in American shipbuilding capacity, they're going to have to do more than just this. So that's your trade update for the week.
Thank you. We're making moves. Not sure if they're good ones, but definitely moves.
Yeah, the administration is doing stuff, but again, just to kind of summarize, it's not clear what the end point is. It could be that maybe they do want to invade Canada and they're trying to destroy their economy. I think more likely they're trying to extract more superficial concessions, or maybe they're trying to do something in between. After the past week, it seems more like something in between, but that's deeply weird. Again, it just doesn't really add up to me, and I have no idea what the strategy is right now. It's particularly confusing at the moment. So we'll see if the upcoming week offers any clarity. I'm not really entirely optimistic in that regard, but we'll see.
Well, I don't know how much you have, but just assessing, we're at 2 hours and there are questions.
Okay, let me get that. I mentioned something. I was going to describe something, and it totally slipped my mind.
Chat's mentioning invasive species as a way to retaliate against a country. If you've ever been to Hawaii, oh my gosh, people brought all kinds of crap to Hawaii that's from very far from Hawaii. You've got a lot of different plants from Africa. You've got bamboo, which is from China. Like, these are very distant places from Hawaii, and Hawaii has a very isolated ecosystem. So a bunch of these plants and so on can just overrun and overgrow stuff. Freaking bamboo is a crazy plant. It grows hella fast. It's hella strong. Takes up a whole bunch of area.
It can be very costly.
They're going to have to airdrop pandas in.
Invasive species, yeah.
Yep.
Well, I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I guess we can go through some questions here. Any update on the court cases regarding congressional spending, the Trump administration's theory of impoundment? Not a whole lot. I think USAID is the one that got a big Supreme Court ruling in its favor. I have it in my notes. We may or may not get to it later, but the Supreme Court did rule that USAID had to pay contractors that it was contractually obligated to pay. It was about $2 billion worth. So that suggests that the administration does not have just complete free reign, just to cut spending in that vein. That's kind of sort of impoundment, though. I think there are, bigger crises on the horizon. Whether or not the administration is obligated to pay outstanding contracts, whatnot, that's more what they were dealing with there. Whether or not the administration can just full on cut all aid outright, despite Congress creating USAID and demanding that it, basically do exactly that. That's more where the issue is. And there hasn't been a court ruling on that yet. And there's probably going to be more, if there aren't already, court rulings on some of the other stuff they've done relating, that is impoundment adjacent. But I haven't heard any updates yet on those. I think they're still cooking, so to speak. Let's see. Seems that Trump and Musk are intent on cutting spending in scientific research as a part of larger scale cuts. In particular, I've heard rumors they plan to cut around 50% of the NSF's budget. How do you think this will impact America's standing in the world technologically? I mean, negative. Standing is kind of an amorphous, ambiguous thing. So, there's not really a clear-cut way to measure that. But in general, if you are just gutting your research budget, that's not going to have a positive impact on your standing in the world technologically. Yeah, the NSF and just government investment in research in general is one of those things that conservative and left-wing economists actually agree on. And that's not like a big overlap. There's not a whole lot they agree on, but this is one of the few. In general, everybody kind of agrees that government investment and encouragement of investment in new technologies is a net positive for everybody and should be encouraged. So the fact that the current government seems to think that, cutting it is a good idea and will save money, I think that just speaks to the lack of focus and discipline and the approach they're taking to cutting. I think I said before last week that there was evidence that, Doge and the government's whole approach to cutting was just to cut as much as possible, as quickly as possible, wherever possible, regardless of context or circumstances. And the past couple weeks, I think, have kind of borne that out. I think they are just going for low-hanging fruit, not because they think that's the right thing to do, but because they think that's going to be the most rewarding approach performatively. In other words, I think the cuts are just performative for the most part. Some of the cuts may stick long term, some won't. But I don't think anybody sat down or is sitting down and looking at what the government is spending money on and trying to find actual waste, fraud, and abuse. I think that would be a much more rigorous approach, but it would also take much longer, and it's not likely to get you like big results that will be very satisfying for your voters. The current performative approach, on the other hand, generates lots of headlines. It makes people upset. And in that way, it makes voters very satisfied, in so much as there's voters that wanted to see that. So the NSF, I think, cutting that and other technological research programs of one kind or another, definitely a negative. I think if you did do a rigorous approach to cost cutting to see what was worth cutting and what was not, I don't think the NSF would be on the table for cuts if that was the approach they were taking.
Well, we're playing StarCraft 2 right now, and everybody who plays StarCraft 2 knows that tech is one of the axes that you grow and develop over the course of the game. So if you're cutting your tech research, you're cheesing. This is now a cheese and an all-in, where you're staying on whatever your current tier of tech is, and if anyone else invests X amount of money into the future tech and you don't, then you fall behind. You got to tech up. But I'm a macro streamer, so I'm biased.
Well, we could use some more macro streamers in government right now, Neuro. You should send in an application to Doge.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people think the Korean gamers do when they have their military training. Is they're getting them to do some crazy high-level shit. These guys are too fast and too smart.
Let's see. What are my thoughts on Israel preparing to implement Trump's Gaza plan while Egypt and Saudi Arabia are not willing to participate? If Egypt and Saudi Arabia are not willing to participate, then it's not going to happen, because his plan specifically outlines relocation to their territories as being integral. And I don't think any other Arab country is going to volunteer either, given just how incendiary relocation would be. Yeah, the whole plan just struck me as just him bullshitting. He was just talking off the cuff like he always does. And then after he talked off the cuff, he asked his subordinates to try to make it happen, or at least pretend to. That's a common behavior for him. So I never really took it seriously in the first place. I haven't seen anything in the past couple weeks to suggest I was wrong to do so. I would be more interested in the Israeli aid cutoff to Gaza and the negotiations that have come out of that. That's more substantive. Washington is just kind of in the background acting stupid. I have no idea what contribution they're substantively making to the negotiations at this point. We'll see. That is a developing story. Okay, those were the questions from the end of last week. Oh, I skipped one. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for doing all of that. Posting the questions and doing the check mark. Any updates on the court cases? Oh, no, I did do that one. Okay. Okay, so for today, the questions. I'd like to hear my thoughts on the budget proposal in Congress. Yeah. Have you heard of this, Neuro, the new budget being negotiated?
No.
Yeah, so there's another countdown to doomsday here, where we're days away from the government shutdown. And it's not clear if Congress can really make the cut here and avoid it. So there's been fervent negotiations happening, trying to get a new budget passed. And the House actually did successfully vote one through. They still have to go through the reconciliation progress with whatever bill the Senate ends up passing. It's not clear what that's going to look like. But the House did get one out, and it's already caused some controversy because there's a lot of cuts in it to Medicaid. What they're trying to do is trying to find lots of cuts to the budget so that they can pay for the continuation of the 2017 tax cuts. For those of you who don't remember, one of the big achievements from the first Trump term was that he oversaw the passage of significant tax cuts, mostly in the form of corporate tax cuts, but also some for others. And those tax cuts had a sunset provision in which they would basically be removed in 2025 or 6, I forget which year. And the provision was that they could be continued if Congress voted for it. And so that's what they're talking about now. So don't be fooled by, Congress saying, hey, we're trying to pass a tax cut. They're actually not. What they're actually trying to do is to preserve a pre-existing tax cut. So if they actually successfully pass this, or more accurately, successfully continue the tax cuts, this is not going to be a stimulus to the economy. This should not boost it. Because again, what they're doing is just not changing something. They're not reducing taxes even further or increasing them. This is just status quo that they're doing. So hypothetically, there should not be any notable change from this, other than perhaps a change from any changes that were incurred by market actors pricing in the potential risk of a failure to continue the trade, to continue the tax cuts. There could be some changes on there, but I would expect those to be pretty marginal in nature. Anyway, that's what they're trying to do, and one of the big ways they want to pay for it, at least in the House bill as it's designed, is to act to the agency that manages Medicaid to find, quote unquote, $800 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse that they can cut. And the suspicion is that they're not really going to find $800 billion worth of waste, fraud, and abuse. The suspicion is that they're just going to make $800 billion worth of cuts to services. And of course, that has a lot of people very upset because a lot of people use Medicaid. And I think even Steve Bannon, Mr. Alt-Right himself from back in the day, came out and warned the administration not to fuck around too much with Medicaid, because there's actually a lot of people who voted for Trump who use it, especially in some of the poorer states. So that's kind of been the drama there. I haven't seen enough of the rest of the budget to really pass judgment on it. And I'm actually more interested to see what the Senate does, and then to see what the reconciliation process looks like after the fact. One of the other things that they've been doing is kind of going back and forth between the Senate on a one bill versus two bill approach to dealing with the problem. The Senate actually prefers, and I think I actually talked about this a couple months ago and fucked it up, so consider this also a correction. The Senate wants to pass a budget bill first and then deal with other stuff later. So from their perspective, it would be better to deal with the budget now and then deal with the tax cuts after the fact in a separate bill. The House prefers to deal with both at the same time. And I think that is in their budget. So what we end up with as far as a final budget bill is going to depend on whether or not the Senate plays ball with the House and gives them what they want, or if the Senate plays hardball and tries to lean on the House to go with their two bill approach rather. So we'll see what happens with that. That's where the drama is. But beyond that, I don't have enough of the details to really have a lot to comment on right now. I think certainly the Republicans, if they do go with a Medicaid cut-driven approach to paying for the tax cuts, will definitely be playing with fire, because that's one of the third rails of American politics that you're not supposed to touch. Let's see, is employment opportunity going to improve in 2025? I've been unemployed for 10 months and the amount of applicants is insane. It depends on what you're trying to get into. Different industries are going to be impacted differently by economic trends, all the stuff we've been talking about, for example, and also just structurally have different prospects for new people trying to enter them. So, I don't know if you're like a guy just out of high school who's looking for some low-wage work to get by, and maybe you haven't been able to find any, or if you're like a PhD grad who's having trouble finding work. Similar problem, but very different contexts. So that can be the answer can be wildly different. From the PhD perspective, which I almost was, it's going to be hard because the field is just flooded. Maybe I shouldn't say that because it's been like 10 years since I was in the program. Maybe a little bit less, but I imagine the market conditions for PhDs have changed in that time. But back in my day, the market for PhDs was flooded because a whole shit ton of people had joined PhD programs because of the financial crisis. A whole bunch of people couldn't find work and so figured, okay, I'll go to school for a while. And then hopefully by the time I graduate, then economic conditions will have improved. And the trouble was that so many people had the same idea at the same time that within a few years, there was a huge glut of PhD grads on the market. And it became then, as a result, very difficult to find work as a PhD. So if that's the boat you're in, and assuming market conditions have not changed significantly, it will be difficult for you to find a job for a while. I don't know why I'm assuming you're a PhD, though. Probably not. But yeah, again, it just depends on the market you're into. One of the things I've read as far as employment is that even though there's low unemployment right now, people are still having trouble finding jobs. And one of the reasons I've read for that is because a lot of firms are still a little paranoid about turnover. So everybody got burned. That is to say, businesses got burned very hard during and after the pandemic because of turnover. During the economic recovery, it was very easy for people to find higher wages by changing jobs. And so people kept doing that. And the result then, that combined with, pandemic restrictions of one kind or another, resulted in a shortage of labor. And so businesses got very paranoid about it. And the result is that they started hiring people and just hanging on to them. Even if they couldn't afford them, didn't need them, they would still hang on to them just in case they needed them later. So the upshot of that is a lot of job security for people who were able to find jobs. But the downside is that firms hired so many people and hung on to them that they got it to a point where they didn't really need anybody new. If economic conditions improved, they wouldn't need to hire anybody. They probably already had people on hand ready to fill that role, ready to increase capacity. So there's been kind of a detachment between shifts in economic conditions and hiring as a result of that weird dynamic. Now, I'm sure there's other factors at play. This is just one potential explanation, but it's something to keep in mind as you're searching for work. It could be that there's just not a lot of places that need labor because they've been hiring labor reserves, basically. But again, mileage may vary. Some industries have done that more than others. It could be that you just live in a place that is relatively economically depressed, because it's not just industries where your mileage may vary, it's also regions. So places like rural America, those places struggle relatively more. Urban America tends to have more job opportunities, especially suburban America, and especially places like North Texas, where I live. There's lots more jobs here opening up and available than there are in places like, fucking Cleveland, Ohio, which has done better over the past 10 years, but is still not like a beacon of economic liberty. As far as finding and making a living, Cleveland is perhaps not the best choice as far as places to live and go to for looking for work. So I don't know. Again, I just don't know your circumstances. So move to a place where there's more jobs. Try to get into an industry where there's more dynamism and more opportunities available. Invest in education if you haven't done that already. This is all just basic stuff like job coaches will tell you, so I don't really have anything to add. And I'm not an especially good job coach either, so I would be worried about taking my advice in the first place. But yeah, that's kind of the best I could do with that limited bit of information. As far as the broader question of how is the economy going to do in 2025, is it going to do better? Probably not. I think you would be hard pressed right now to look at markets and say, oh yeah, those are all signals that things are going great. There's just so much uncertainty right now that investors are very wary about investing. And that suggests that there's probably going to be a Darwinian ratchet of a kind. I shouldn't say Darwinian ratchet, a ratchet effect, where basically the more time goes by in which investors delay investment, the more negative the impact on the economy is going to be. Because you do need semi-regular investment in an economy to generate new jobs for people. And if investment slackens, then nothing will happen in the short term, but in the long term, there's going to be a lot of opportunity costs that you incur. And until the Trump administration just stops acting crazy and starts giving more certainty to markets, I don't predict that investors will significantly increase investment. And so probably by the end of the year, that will result in very middling economic performance for the United States economically. And that's to say nothing of the impact inflation is going to have, since the administration is basically just doing a whole bunch of inflationary things all at once, none of which is going to be especially good for the inflation issue that the economy kind of, sort of still has. It's been getting better. I maintain that it's at a pretty decent place, even if it still hasn't gotten down to the Fed's target rate. But it's been slipping in a negative direction the past couple months. There's been lots of hedging going on, and that's had a negative impact. So, yeah, lots of uncertainty, unclear just what'll happen, but all of the signs here from uncertainty and inflation are that the economy is going to face some headwinds. And in so much as that remains the dominant trend for the year, I would expect relatively worse performance over time this year rather than better. Let's see. I think in the last episode, you have referred to kayfabe and theater as a strategy. Do these strategies have a counter, and have they backfired in the past? There's no counter strategy that is without risk. And the trouble with that is, the trouble there is that the United States is just so big and has the potential to hurt you so much, even if it's just half-assing it and just pretending to threaten you, that challenging it with a counter strategy comes with higher risks than if you were dealing with a peer country. So the United States is in a uniquely strong position to do this kind of bullshit without consequence, which means that there's not really a good counter strategy there. So that said, in general, the counter strategy is just to stand up to them. If you think the other guy is bluffing, call the bluff. And if he then carries through with the bluff, then you can just try to grin and bear it. Take the pain and try to prove to them that you're willing to take the pain over the long term, and that it would be better for both of you if you just came to an agreement. So with Canada and Mexico, hypothetically then, the counter strategy should be stand up to the United States, call the bluff, make them do the trade war, make them incur the pain, and then make it apparent that your public is willing to back you through the pain to a greater degree than the American public is, so that you have some leverage to bring to bear negotiations, to bring the trade war to an end and reach some kind of condominium, some kind of new understanding. I don't know that Trump's core supporters are going to abandon him even if the trade war goes badly, but there's half the country that already hates his guts, and there's probably a kingmaker sliver of the American voting public that would turn on him if things went badly, and that could be enough to make a difference. Of course, all of that assumes that the Trump administration is sensitive to public opinion, which sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. If giving in means looking embarrassed and weak, they may just ignore it. They may ignore the pain and just try to continue to apply pressure until you give ground. So nominally, that's what Mexico and Canada should do as their counter strategy. But again, the United States has so much more leverage than they do as far as the imbalance in the size of their respective economies, that it would be very hard for them to do that without significant economic disruption. So if they want to do it, it's a brave thing to do and more power to them. But the cost-benefit analysis is not favorable in that regard. And there's every possibility it could just fail completely. Let's see, with Trump seemingly not following through or walking back so many of his threats, how does the world take anything the US does seriously? I personally don't. And honestly, even before the Trump administration, I was kind of getting to that point. Now with the Trump administration, I'm definitely at that point. So yeah, I don't think there's much reason for the rest of the world to take us seriously at this point. I think there's going to come a point when the rest of the world figures out that the Trump administration is mostly talk and not so much substance. Certainly the Trump administration, as we discussed at the top, is willing to engage in very disruptive behavior as part of its theater, some of which can be very disruptive to partners, destroy livelihoods, even kill people sometimes, or more accurately, result in deaths. Let's put it like that. But even so, even if the administration is willing to go that far, I still don't think that they're really willing to kind of go to the extent that they threatened to go to. So once the rest of the world really starts to internalize that and starts to figure out where the line is, between what the administration threatens to do and what it's actually willing to go through with, I think you're going to see more countries start to signal that they don't take the administration seriously and that they're only going to engage with it on substance and not, with this stupid theater bullshit that the administration seems to enjoy so much. China actually already kind of does that. The Communist Party of China is not really willing to indulge the administration in this stuff, which is why you haven't seen them in the news that much. You'll note that tariffs were applied on China, Mexico, and Canada over the past, off and on for the past month and change. But you've only really heard about Canada and Mexico responding to it. China has implemented some retaliatory tariffs, but they've been pretty minor, very middling in nature. And the reason for that is, one, they were prepared for this. They kind of assumed that regardless of what they did, more tariffs were incoming anyway. So not much sense then in whining about it when it happens. But also, they figure that if the Trump administration wants to substantively engage in negotiations about the trading relationship, then they'll come to them. They'll try to start a negotiation. They'll try to set something up. And until they do, then the Chinese are just going to assume the administration is really serious, and they'll just ignore them. That's the approach thus far. And it's more or less been working. You'll note that the administration's vitriol has mostly been directed at other parties than China. They really have not been in the headlines much. So keeping a low profile seems to be a winning move when dealing with Trump, regardless of if you're a friend or an enemy. The CCP figured that out. The Japanese figured that out. The Koreans figured that out. The rest of the world just kind of needs to catch up. I think that's where everybody's going to end up eventually. I was surprised it didn't happen during the first Trump administration, honestly. I've got to think it's got to happen in the second administration, the second term of the administration. But we'll see. Who's to say? Do you believe Trump actually cares about the well-being of the United States, or is he purely in it for self-serving purposes, regardless of what happens to the country? I don't think that's binary. I don't think those are mutually exclusive possibilities. I think Trump himself probably does think that he cares about the country and that he's doing things that are to its benefit. But I also think he's self-serving. I think he believes that being self-serving is not outside the realm of normal politics. Because keep in mind, he's a very cynical person. He and the people he most appeals to think that the government is intrinsically corrupt in the United States and elsewhere, and that all politicians are self-interested actors who get away with as much as they can whenever possible. And that if Trump does it, it's not any different than any other politician. Trump is just more honest about it by being open about his being a self-interested, corrupt asshole. So they think other politicians are exactly the same. They just hide it better because they're sneaky and devious. So I think Trump himself thinks like that, and so thinks that being self-serving and engaging in behavior that benefits him, even if it breaks norms, even if it what's the word I want? Harms the republic, let's say. That's not great wording. I forget that. But you get the idea. Breaking the norms of the republic and undermining the democratic political culture in the United States by being a corrupt politician. None of that is good, but if you think that's a normal behavior, then why would you have a problem with it? Trump himself and many of his followers have that mindset. That's kind of the point. I think we've talked before about corruption and the nature therein. How corruption is very difficult to uproot, specifically because people in power assume it's the norm and in turn don't take issue. And in fact, not only don't take issue with it, but get mad at people in power who don't engage in corruption because they think they're only doing it to fuck with them. So I think Trump's mindset is that being self-interested is normal, being corrupt is normal, and he deserves credit despite that, despite engaging in corruption, not only because it's actually normal, but because he is doing things that the public has been asking for a long time, but which establishment politicians have not been willing to do. So, for example, cracking down on immigration, cracking down on trade, all of this populist stuff that other politicians have teased but never done because it's mostly bullshit, he actually does. And he likely thinks that's a net benefit. And it could be that he also believes that protectionism may actually be in the interest of the United States. I don't think that's actually true, though. I don't think it's true, because if he actually thought protectionism was the way to go, then he should just do it. He doesn't need to engage in all this weird performative theatrical bullshit. Like, he could just do it, impose it on the rest of the world, and there wouldn't be a whole lot they could do about it. So I think the fact that he does engage in as much trade theatrics as he does kind of betrays the fact that he doesn't really think protectionism is all as great as he says it is. I think he just sees it as being useful to use America's economic heft as leverage in negotiations to get other stuff that he actually does prioritize. Regardless, I think he thinks his approach to governance is a net benefit to the United States, and I don't think he sees any contradiction between his behavior that is populist in nature and his behavior that is just very obviously undermining American democratic culture, institutions and whatnot. So again, just to kind of summarize, it's not, those two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. I think it's both. I think he thinks he's serving the public interest and is being self-interested. I read Turkey's position on any peace deal I read Turkey's position that any peace deal is Ukrainian territorial. I read Turkey's position on any peace deal is Ukrainian territorial sovereignty is non-negotiable. There we go. What are they doing on their end other than talk to push for that? Not a whole lot. Turkey has been very, very much an opportunistic actor vis-a-vis Ukraine. They were happy to sell them lots of arms, drones. I think everybody remembers the Bayraktar song. But after that, they also kind of indulged Russia by being a major re-export node. So lots of stuff that Europe didn't want to sell to Russia, or didn't want sold to Russia anyway, ended up getting diverted to Turkey. Turkish buyers or Russian actors in Turkey would buy stuff that was sanctioned, that Russia should not have been able to buy. They would buy it in Turkey as Turkish actors and then move the product on to Russia, since Turkey was not participating as much in the sanctions regime, which was a fairly pro-Russian position to take. So Turkey was kind of playing both sides and still is for the most part. But they have said recently that they would back Ukraine as part of the peace negotiations. Basically, there's talk about European peacekeepers as part of a potential peace deal. I mentioned it before several times. The Turkish government has come out and said that they would be willing to contribute to that. So that's a fairly pro-Ukrainian position. I think they also said that they would want to participate in a European army or new European defense arrangement if it were to emerge. So, all of that is on the table as far as Turkey is concerned, which suggests that they are leaning towards the West as far as the confrontation with Russia. However, I have noted that they're still not really willing to crack down on the re-export issue. So I think Turkey is trying to have its cake and eat it too, as they so often have in their modern history. They want to maintain economic ties to Russia, which is significant not only in terms of re-export, but in terms of Russian tourism. Lots of Russians go to Turkey on vacation, and also in terms of Russian investment in things like resorts and whatnot. Turkey wants the benefit of that while still maintaining defense ties with the West. Let's see, any news in the Burma-Myanmar front? The military junta said that they want to hold elections, which is stupid, because that's obviously not going to happen when they don't even control broad swaths of the country at this point. I think some of the rebel groups have taken more territory. I think the government has lost all of Arakan province except for like 2 cities now, one of which is the capital. Other than that, nothing new, at least nothing that I've noted. Or if I do have something in my notes, I'm not remembering it. I have many notes over the past couple months, many of which I haven't gotten to yet. So it's entirely possible I overlooked something.
Appreciate your notes.
Okay, the last question we have here is, given the recent West Virginia artificial food dye ban, what effect do you see it having on the market for the rest of the country when it comes into effect? I hadn't seen that. West Virginia artificial dye ban. I mean, West Virginia is not like a big mover and shaker as far as setting the pace for policy making and the rest of the country. So, I mean, my immediate impression is that it's not going to have much of an effect at all. But it kind of depends on the nature of it and what kind of impact it has. And unless I know what that is, then I can't really say. And like I mentioned, I wasn't aware of it. So thank you for bringing it to my attention. I'll take a look at it. But otherwise, I don't really have much I can say about it without reading more about it. RFK has been in the news more. I've seen some of the stuff he's done, little of which has really inspired much confidence in me. But it's still early. He could still impress later. I think he's supposed to meet with a bunch of food company execs pretty soon. So we'll see what comes out of that. But yeah, other than that, I don't know what this food dye thing is about. An unsatisfying answer to the final question. Kind of anticlimactic.
A brave I don't know.
Let's see. How are we doing on time?
About 15 minutes left.
15 minutes. And there's much more. There's so much more. Yeah, there's been more stuff on Doge, personnel changes, the military. Some of the government's plans for changes to the military budget have come out. Some foreign policy dumb shit. There's plenty of that. Program cuts. What else did I have here? Oh, misinformation. Lots of that going around. More executive orders. The gold card plan just made me laugh. That was
Oh, yeah. I saw the rich people can get in easy.
yeah. $5 million. For $5 million, you can buy a visa into the United States. I thought we got past this. It used to be really common for governments to allow wealthy investors to basically buy a visa by investing a bunch of money, because that was a quid pro quo. If you invested a certain amount of money, then there would be a special category of visa that you could apply to and get. And that was around for a very long time as an incentive to attract investment, but eventually almost everybody withdrew them and canceled them. Because, the problem is obvious, right? You could be a wealthy malefactor, like a drug trader or something, and just buy your way into a wealthy country where you can just kind of hide out and launder money. So, Russian oligarchs did that a lot. They would Londongrad, right? The famous nickname for London, because they had so many Russian oligarchs setting up there. And there was concern that they were starting to influence politics by becoming big donors and movers and shakers in the political scene. So, just the implications and consequences of just allowing foreign wealthy people to buy their way into your country and set up shop, that had resulted in a general shift away from this. But the Trump administration apparently doesn't take issue. They were quite proud of it. And the funny thing to me was that Trump even joked about it while he was signing the order. He actually joked that maybe some Russian oligarchs could come over. He knows some. They're not all bad, apparently.
Wow.
English is the official language. There's a bunch of crypto stuff. I'm going to try to read more about that. It's exactly as dumb as it sounds. Take It Down Act. We'll talk more about that next time. I think that's worth getting more into. RFK, some stuff. They released the Epstein files. That was really dumb. There's been some military base renamings. Again, it just goes on and on. There's been some court rulings. I think I already mentioned one Supreme Court ruling against the USAID aid thing. Columbia University. They arrested somebody for protesting at a university. That was just, I think, a day or two ago. Yeah, budget negotiations. We got to that. The measles outbreak in Texas. That's been dumb. That's frustratingly dumb. There's a lot of dumb stuff to talk about, but the measles outbreak thing, very frustrating. And there's a bunch of other stuff too in my notes for the rest of the world that we haven't even been able to get to yet. The Chinese Navy sailed around Australia. There's been some trade war stuff. I've got some stuff on some of the legal stuff that the administration wants to use to try to justify cracking down on immigration. I've got other stuff about norms in government and the ones that the administration has breached thus far. I talk a lot about norms, but I don't always have specifics, so I thought it might be useful to kind of go through some of them. And I'm sure we'll have more stuff on trade and peace, Ukraine negotiations, next time. So that'll probably continue to be a big feature.
Chet saying Austria has a government.
Austria has a new government, but I think they're still negotiating its composition. I think there were talks to have the far right party join in for the first time, but I think those negotiations fell through, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't seen an update on that in a while, so maybe that's changed. But last I checked, the far right party was set not to be in the governing coalition. I think it's called the FPO, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, there was that drama in Austria. There's been mass protests in Serbia, ongoing for months. I don't think we've talked about that hardly at all. Slovakia has had some big protests against Prime Minister Fico, I think his name is. And some other stuff as well, but I guess we'll have to save that. If the Trump administration could just chill the fuck out for a month, I would have time to get to this. So I would appreciate it if they would. Syria update. Yeah, there's been some violence in Syria recently. There was like a minor rebellion in Latakia in the northwest of the country where the Alawites live. And there's also been some clashes in the south. Apparently there were some Assad loyalists that tried to fight some security guys working for the new government, and that resulted in, well, obviously fighting on the spot, but then it also resulted in some reprisal killings that killed a couple hundred civilians. That eventually stopped when the government stepped in, because the guys doing the killing were apparently foreign fighters. Uzbeks and Uyghurs is what I heard. So apparently there was some violence there in that regard. It's not clear if that's escalated since then. I think the government's got it under control, but that does illustrate the underlying tensions there that are still existent since the war ended. And there's been some other negotiations too that we'll have to get to later. Got a list of stuff there.
Someone just asked a question about Lena Khan and the FTC work on monopolies.
Yeah, that was one of the items on my list here. I thought that was a particularly interesting one too. So since you bring it up, so Lena Khan, for those of you who don't know, was the chairman of the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission. And that's the main agency in the US government that is responsible for enforcing antitrust provisions in American law. So basically, if a company tries to monopolize a market, the FTC is the agency that's supposed to stop that. And as you might imagine, the FTC has been pretty useless for a couple decades now. But during the Biden administration, early on, he brought on Lena Khan to be the new chairman of the FTC, and she actually did go pretty hard trying to litigate antitrust provisions, more so than any FTC commission had in a very, very long time. And there were very high hopes early in the Biden administration that she would be successful and would introduce more competition into the US market that would benefit everybody. And in turn, by doing so, reducing somewhat the power, economic and political, of American corporations, which have been running riot for a long time. So her record was mixed. She wasn't entirely able to win every case that she brought, but she was able to win some victories. And the question was, would the Trump administration allow her to stay on, for one? And if not, would the new people that he appointed want to continue in the Lena Khan vein of being relatively anti-corporation and pro-competition? Or if Trump would do the prototypical Republican thing, which is to just kind of do what the corporations wanted them to do. So he did not keep Lena Khan on, which was very discouraging. However, there was a statement released by the FTC, I think a month ago or so, saying that they would largely continue to approach their antitrust mission in the same way that Lena Khan had, which was very encouraging. So whether or not they actually do it, though, now is the remaining question. Because, of course, the Trump administration and, of course, Trump himself are known for being very transactional. So it's not entirely clear that the FTC and the Trump administration are going to take a hard line on corporations because they genuinely want to be pro-competition, or if they just want leverage to bring to bear against corporations. So if there's a corporation that does something the administration doesn't like, maybe they can sick the FTC on them. Maybe the corporation is trying to do a deal. The FTC maybe gave a pass on it before, but maybe after the falling out with Trump, they go after them. So that's the kind of weapon that the administration could bring to bear in order to try to bring economic entities like corporations and whatnot into line. So that's what we'll be watching for. Is this just a weapon in the quiver of the administration to use while they weaponize the bureaucracy, or is this just a genuine expression of pro-competition sentiment? This is what we don't know yet. So that's what to watch for. Open question.
We shall see. There's one more question, but it seems like it would take a long time to answer, but I'll throw it out there and get an initial impression. Ask Mr. Smith about the ties between the U.S., Canada, and Europe in general with Israel. There are pictures of Trump and Zelensky compared to Trump with Israel's prime minister. Why are our countries so close to Israel? I heard a lot of politicians have advisors with dual citizenship with Israel, which is a conflict of interest in their opinion.
Yeah, that gets into history. Germany in particular has a guilt complex vis-a-vis, the Holocaust, Jews, etc. And so ever since World War II, successive German governments have felt compelled to support Israel just for that reason. There are a lot of people in Germany critical of Israel because of the Palestinian issue, but the German government has generally, to varying degrees, suppressed that sentiment. It's relatively harder to criticize Israel in Germany than in other places because of the historical factor and because of the German government's approach to dealing with it. So that explains Germany. The rest of Europe kind of has a similar relationship, although it tends to be a little more transactional. Generally, they either don't comment at all, staying out of it, or they try to cut deals with Israel, generally involving defense or something. Israeli technology is pretty good. The defense sector, the tech sector are pretty well advanced. And so they tend to kind of find themselves in a position to negotiate with other states on access. So partly that's the reason, at least for Europe anyway, outside of Germany. The UK also has some historical reasons for supporting Israel, just going back to the Balfour Declaration and Britain's historical role in the Middle East. Although these days it's just more to do with following the US lead. As far as Canada, they kind of have their own approach, but largely they stay out of it. I don't think Canada really has a strong position on Israel-Palestine. They don't have any leverage. They don't have any historical baggage. So I've never known the Canadian government to really weigh in heavily one way or the other. I think the most they do is provide humanitarian aid and then also just moral support. They just kind of stay in the benches and hope for the best. Washington is a different animal. The reason the United States backs Israel so much, partly it has to do with history, partly to do with domestic politics. The United States basically is the reason Israel exists. We're the one that was the kind of the decisive vote in the UN as far as whether or not Israel would be brought into existence by way of UN declaration. And after that, there was a big question in the United States, specifically in the foreign policy community, about whether or not the United States should continue to back Israel, given that the entire fucking Arab world just hated the partition of Palestine to the bottom of their, to the core of their beings. And alienating a whole region like that, especially early in the decolonization period, when a lot of those states were becoming independent and had a choice of whether to align with the Soviets or the United States in the Cold War, was wise. Should we be alienating those people? The answer was probably, or at least should have been no, but there was also a sense of moral obligation after the Holocaust to try to help the Jewish people. And there was also a sense that the people of Israel kind of deserved their own state. And ultimately, then it was decided that the U.S. would back Israel. And to varying degrees after that, it's been the official policy of the United States to help them survive. And that definitely waxed and waned pretty considerably over time. There were definitely some governments that were not on the best of terms with them, especially in the past couple decades with Netanyahu, who manages to alienate and piss off pretty much every president he interacts with to varying degrees. But regardless, the U.S. has felt compelled to kind of maintain the continuity of its foreign policy position, which again is to try to back Israel's existence and try to help them reach some kind of accord with its neighbors. So that's a historical factor. The domestic political factor has to do with partly Jews. Obviously, there was a big Jewish lobby for a long time, AIPAC, which was very united in support of Israel. It's actually fractured pretty considerably over the past 10, 15 years, so they're not nearly as influential as they used to be. But the Jewish vote was a big vote for a long time, and AIPAC, the main NGO that kind of focused that voting power politically, was influential on that count. And then also there was as we've mentioned many times on here, there was the evangelical vote. There's kind of a core of support in the hardcore evangelical community that backs them for reasons that Neuro is much better at explaining than I am. I keep trying to remember, and I always mess up the details. So there's a core domestic audience, basically, in the United States, Jewish and evangelical Christian, that continues to back Israel to the hilt. And there's also national security considerations. Israel is a pretty reliable ally of the United States, not entirely voluntarily. When you're surrounded by enemies, you kind of have to take who you can get as an ally. And so that gives the United States pretty considerable leverage. And Israel is a very reliable partner because of that. So in terms of defense, industrial-based cooperation, mutually developing new weapons and whatnot, doing mutual research and development projects, and also I would add intelligence sharing, especially, is a big one. Israeli intelligence sharing is top-notch. They're very good. October 7th, obviously a big failure, but as Elon Musk would say, nobody bats 1,000. Every so often, even the best will shit the bed. So that aside, overall, they're very good, and the United States does benefit from intelligence sharing with them because they are just knee-deep in virtually every country in the region. The Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, has infiltrated just about everybody. So it's very useful to be on good terms with them. So those are the main reasons that the United States maintains strong relations with Israel that I can think of off the top of my head on the fly. There may be others, but I think those are the main ones.
Thank you.
So hopefully that's hopefully that's what they were looking for. Hopefully I got to the crux of the question there. But I guess that's all we have time for.
Yeah, pretty much, unless you had any final thoughts or lawyers boxing each other or something.
Final thoughts. Okay.
You have a relatively spicy chat to look forward to. I don't think anyone got timed out or banned, but it was definitely going. Thanks for the engagement, chat.
Yeah, I'm sure people are less and less patient with the Trump administration. Less and less patient with the kayfabe theory, the more actual harm he does. But I'll say I'm going to be stubborn about it and continue to say that it's mostly theater, even if it's damaging, violent theater. I still think the administration is just negotiating. This is them trying to push for stuff. May or may not be substantive stuff, but I still maintain that probably, most likely, the end point is just something that is relatively normal. And I would add as a side note, I guess, because I know we have some people from Ukraine who tolerate me and listen to me, don't give up hope. You probably don't need to hear that from me. I'm sure you were already going to do that. But as far as the United States anyway, it's not over until it's over. I think I said a couple weeks ago, don't pay attention to what the administration says. Pay attention to what they do. And what they've done thus far has mostly been theater. The aid cutoff and the intelligence sharing cutoff has been the most substantive thing, but I would point out that's just probably part and parcel of the whole kayfabe mineral agreement bullshit. I could be wrong. It's entirely possible the administration is just going to go. I wish you could still say retard. I really want to use it sometimes, but yeah, the administration I don't think is going to go all the way on being stupid on Ukraine. I think probably it's mostly theater. So while it's possible they could go that direction, don't be overly pessimistic on it. I suspect within a month's time, maybe longer, there's going to be a full 180 again, like he's done on so many different things. So try to be patient. America is having a dumb moment right now. We've had others before. This one perhaps more so than most, but eventually we'll get through it. And eventually the circus will move on to a different issue. And Ukraine will be something that people remember. That is to say, the Ukraine issue, not the country, will be in the rear view mirror, and the administration will have moved on to bigger and better theater targets.
Different and new wag the dog, for sure.
Oh, yeah. Lots of wagon. The dog's about to die from the fucking wagon.
Well, cool. Appreciate your expertise and your time. It seems like there are a lot more notes generated week to week just because there's a bunch of stuff happening, not necessarily going through, but being said that it's going to go through. So if your work has increased as a result of this stuff this new year, thank you for your time and for your hustle.
Well, I mean, I want to do it because it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. And when it does, you need to have a good record of what's been going on to kind of get a full impression of it, to know what needs to be done to fix it. Mm-hmm. And you also need to try to know as much as you can to argue with all of the people who are going to argue that everything is fine, that the whole thing is bullshit, blah, blah, blah. The people who don't really take it seriously, they don't really demand as high a standard to know what's going on as they'll demand of you as a critic for the status quo. So you do need to bring the heat if you want to communicate with those people. Because if you just come at it and sound like a partisan hack, just coming at the administration for all the things you think are dumb or self-defeating, they're not going to listen to you. I try to be even-handed on here. I've been very diplomatic, I feel, trying to reach out to people and maintain the credibility of this segment and the opinions expressed therein, so that when I do say something the administration does is bad, then it's more credible than if I just say everything is bad.
Well, let's hope we give it our best shot in this coming year.
We will try. We will endeavor to do so.
Well, cool. Thank you for your time and your expertise. Thank you, chat, for your questions and engagement. Thank you, Fuzzy Code, for lending questions. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.